The hearing will come to order. I want to welcome everyone to this hearing on the President's budget submission, and certainly welcoming Acting Director of OMB, Russell Vogt. I will now make my opening statement and yield to myself. I'd like to welcome, again, Acting Director Vogt. Thank you for coming here today to testify on the President's 2020 budget proposal. So let's dive right in. The purpose of this hearing is for us to be the eyes and ears of the American taxpayers on the priorities of the Trump administration as we begin the budget and appropriations process for 2020. Unfortunately, when you look at the budget the Trump administration has produced, it is not responsible or even usable. I described the President's first budget as a betrayal, harsh words for a harsh budget that abandoned working Americans and families. The second proposal continued this pattern, relying on extreme cuts to blunt the deficit-exploding impact of the Republican tax scam at the expense of those same working families and Americans. Now, this third budget proposal offers more of the same. It is a recipe for American decline and relies on a patchwork of gimmicks, fantasy projections, and extreme cuts that forfeit any responsibility for the well-being of the American people and our nation. What this administration is saying to our constituents is that the federal government will no longer have a role in making sure we remain an opportunity-based society, that the American dream is out of reach. In 2020 alone, this proposal would have us do the unthinkable, a 9% cut, not 5% as the White House claims, in non-defense discretionary funds. Over the course of the decade, it would slash non-defense discretionary spending by more than $1 trillion, crippling our economic and national security by disinvesting in education, public health, energy, healthcare research, infrastructure, and activities directly related to our national security, including homeland security, diplomatic operations, veterans healthcare, law enforcement, food safety, disease prevention and control. In short, it is a complete abandonment of our responsibility to the American people, and it is intentional. You can't cut Medicare by $500 billion without knowing it will hurt our nation's seniors. You can't cut Medicaid by a similar amount without knowing it will result in families losing health care coverage. You can't cut student loans by more than $200 billion without knowing it will make it harder, if not impossible, for young people to go to college. You can't cut nutrition assistance by more than $220 billion without knowing it will leave families without food to put on the table. And you can't gut the EPA by more than 30% without knowing it will make our air less safe and our water less clean. These cuts in the Trump budget aren't a tightening of the belt or a trimming of the fat or even a serious attempt at reining in spending. They are extreme to a level that is malicious, a level that is intended to do harm. But that's not all. On top of all the damage done in the name of so-called fiscal restraint, this budget calls for $1 trillion in additional tax cuts for the wealthy. This is on top of the tax scam enacted in 2017 that showered tax cuts on the rich and wealthy corporations while adding trillions to our deficits. None of it adds up or makes sense, which explains some of the more creative aspects of the President's budget. The administration uses every gimmick, alternative projection, and accounting trick in the book to disguise its true ramifications. One of the most striking parts in this budget is the inclusion of $165 billion for overseas contingency operations, a stunning figure. Director Vogt, you're not even trying to hide this attempt to skirt the cap on defense funding and obscure the true cost of military operations. In your op-ed, you implore fiscal conservatives to accept this gimmick as a backdoor way to supercharge defense spending and avoid negotiating realistic and responsible budget caps for both defense and non-defense funding. I'm sorry, but you don't get many points for being honest about being dishonest. It doesn't work that way. This is a gimmick, and it deserves the swift bipartisan dismissal with which it has been met. The only way we can begin a productive budget and appropriations process is by committing to honest and realistic budgeting and reaching an agreement to raise the caps for discretionary spending. It is my hope that through this hearing we can conduct an open and honest examination of the priorities set forth by the Trump administration and begin to craft a budget that truly reflects the needs and priorities of the American people. Once again, I want to thank Acting Director Vogt for being here today, and I look forward to your testimony. I now yield to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Acting Director Vogt, for joining us today. As this committee works to craft a budget resolution for the fiscal year ahead, we appreciate the opportunity to discuss President Trump's budget and its spending priorities with you today. As you know, while the Constitution gives Congress the power of the purse, funding the priorities of the American people while addressing our nation's fiscal challenges is not an easy task. It requires collaboration on both sides of the aisle, both chambers of the Capitol, and both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. This is particularly true when the American people have sent a divided government to Washington, as they have with the 116th Congress. That's why hearing from the administration today is so important. As the Congressional Budget Office warned earlier this year, our nation is nearing a fiscal crisis. I would argue we're already in one. It may not seem like one. The markets haven't responded yet, but I sense that there's some smoldering going on that could lead to a potential raging fire, as it were, regarding the nation's deficit and debt. At our current spending levels, over the next decade, deficits will total $11.6 trillion, and the national debt will rise to nearly $34 trillion. Over the same period, the share of debt held by the American people will reach 93% of GDP, the highest debt level since just after World War II. We cannot continue down this path. We have to lead by example, making tough choices necessary to reverse course. While there's still much work to do to put our spending back on a sustainable path, the President's budget takes steps in the right direction. It reduces the deficit by $2.8 trillion between 2020 and 2029, whereas under current law, annual deficits are nearing $1 trillion annually. In 2029, under this proposal, the annual deficit will be lowered to $202 billion. Further, this budget reduces the share of the debt held by the public from nearly 80% of GDP to just over 71% of GDP. That's a vast improvement from the historically high debt levels projected for 2029 under current law. Additionally, there are a number of priorities I'm pleased to see in the budget. For example, the budget takes steps to secure our borders and support our troops and veterans. As someone who has served in the military, I believe ensuring the safety and security of the American people is the most fundamental purpose of the federal government, and I appreciate the administration's clear commitment to these priorities. I also appreciate the administration's focus in this budget on improving the long-term health of the American people by investing in life-saving medical research, efforts to combat the opioid epidemic, and reforms to improve our health care system. But as I've said before, our biggest threat to all of these priorities and to the long-term security, health, and prosperity of our nation is out-of-control mandatory spending. Today, mandatory programs account for 70% of all federal spending and are projected to increase to 78% by 2029. These programs have grown far beyond their intended size and scope and have far exceeded what we can afford. Without action, not only will these programs crowd out resources for other priorities, they will be unable to deliver the benefit workers today expect for the future. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle are choosing to ignore that reality and introducing ideas for new mandatory programs while also looking to raise the Budget Control Act spending caps for FY 2020. As we move forward in the budget process, I again ask, what is your plan to offset these increases? At our Members' Day hearing last week, we were pleased to hear from the distinguished Majority Leader of the House, Mr. Hoyer. It was very productive discussion about the need for a caps deal. However, I noticed we've not heard much from our friends on the other side about how they would pay for such a deal. It's been suggested that we should use the Ryan Murray deal from 2013 as a model for a caps deal. If that's our benchmark, I look forward to hearing recommendations for offsetting increases in discretionary spending by addressing out-of-control mandatory spending. Mr. Chairman, before I yield back, as late as last night, I saw news that suggested that there is a debate about whether the majority party even plans to do a budget. I want you to know, I feel your pain. I've been there. But it's like asking if we're going to do our jobs. And I know I'm speaking to the choir a little bit with my friend, the the budget chairman because we were in agreement on the budget process changes that we were advocating last year in the Joint Select Committee on budget process reform. I will say again, it's a flawed and broken process. It needs to change. We need budget process reform. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to today's discussion. I yield back.
I thank the ranking member, and I look forward to working with you as we work through the issues of budget process reform, as we tried to do last year. Very collegially, I might add. Thank you, and if any other members have opening statements, they may submit them, and they will be published in the record. I now once again introduce the Acting Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Mr. Russell Vogt, and I yield 5 minutes to him for his remarks. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify on President Trump's fiscal year 2020 budget. Yesterday, I submitted my full statement for the record. However, for my oral testimony today, I just want to hit a few key points. Over the past 2 years, President Trump has unleashed the American economy through his pro-growth agenda, which we've coined Maganomics, resulting in a return to prosperity for the American people. Working alongside many of you on this committee, President Trump signed historic tax reform into law, marking the first time in more than 30 years that our nation's tax code was updated and improved. It provided much-needed relief to all Americans, especially the middle class. Throughout his administration, President Trump has implemented a robust regulatory agenda, resulting in small businesses in the American economy saving more than $33 billion in burdensome regulatory costs. However, these great achievements will be challenging to maintain if we do not get our fiscal house in order. Annual deficits are continuing to rise and will exceed $1 trillion a year. Interest payments on the national debt are projected to exceed military spending in 2024. The national debt nearly doubled under the previous administration and is now more than $22 trillion. This level of debt is unsustainable and threatens the prosperity and economic freedom of future generations. The President's commitment to fiscal responsibility has been outlined in previous budgets, and again today he is requesting more reductions to both discretionary and mandatory spending than any other president in history. Yet each time this president has called for fiscal restraint and spending reform, he has been blatantly ignored. Instead, those opposed to decreasing Washington spending have called for large tax increases as a means to reduce deficits. However, not only would this punish taxpayers, destroy jobs, and slow America's economic engine, but it would also ignore the reality of our current fiscal situation. Contrary to fearful predictions of the passage of the historic tax reform, revenues are increasing and are in line with 50-year historic averages. The problem is not that Americans tax too little, it is that Washington spends too much. This budget is yet another fiscally responsible and common-sense spending plan from President Trump. I look forward to working with members of this committee and Congress and remain hopeful that we can prove to the American people that their government is capable of balancing the budget by prioritizing efficient and effective spending. Thank you for your time. I look forward to answering your questions.
I thank the witness, and as is our pattern, the ranking member and I will defer our questions until all of the other members have had their chance. So with that, I yield 5 minutes to the Vice Chairman of the committee, Mr. Moulton of Massachusetts.
Mr. Vogt, thank you very much for joining us here today. I want to share a quote from a prominent politician who talked about endless deficits and said that they would, quote, weigh the country down like an anchor, and that we are on the verge of a debt crisis. Do you know who said that? It was Speaker Paul Ryan. In 2013, he was commenting on the Obama administration in the midst of the 4th straight year of reducing the federal deficit as a percentage of GDP. In reality, how much have deficits and the debt exploded due to the Republican tax law?
Deficits have certainly worsened in the first 2 years, but over 10 years, we believe that deficits will improve, and that as a result of the tax cut and the overall economic program.
You believe that deficits will improve? It's interesting because the OMB has consistently revised up its estimates since the tax law was passed for how big the deficits will be. Is that true?
Our economic program over the life of 10 years.
Mr. Vogt, is that true that you have revised up your deficit estimates since the tax law was passed?
Our estimates have been revised to account for the fact that the tax cut in the short term has led to
So they've been revised up, is that correct?
in the short term, but not
Yes,
over
they've
the,
been revised up.
but not over the
Thank
long
you.
term.
So 1.9 trillion is the estimate that we have over 10 years. That's the estimate that you've produced. I'm just curious, how many of Mr. Trump's $8.6 billion walls could he build with $1.9 trillion?
I haven't done the math on that, sir.
It's more than 220. 220, not 220 miles, 220 of his full walls. Now, just to compare that to some Democratic priorities, what do you think $1.9 trillion would do for education funding in the United States? Would that make a difference in our kids' lives?
We believe this budget fully funds what is necessary to continue to educate our children. We have $50 billion.
So that we can continue falling behind South Korea, China, other competitors around the world in our education standards? Is that what you would like to continue, Mr. Vogt?
One of the reasons why we are putting forward a different type of proposal. We have $50 billion in school choice tax credits that can be done at both the public level or at the private level. It's a paradigm shift that we think is important. We don't think that.
But $1.9 trillion devoted to education, that wouldn't be important.
We believe that we need to fund the education programs that work, that are efficient, that lead to student outcomes that are beneficial. And we also think it's important to look at different ways to be able to invest in our children. We do not believe that a dollar spent necessarily equates with a dollar.
Oh, I agree with you,
caring.
Mr. Vogt. There's no debate there.
But it's a matter of who's doing the spending. Our view is that parents and families, states and localities can often do a better job of educating our
Sometimes
children.
they can, but $1.9 trillion wouldn't help.
We believe we are fully funding what's necessary to educate our children.
Okay, so that's all. It wouldn't help. How many years did President Trump claim it would take to eliminate the national debt under his program?
The President made a commitment to the American people to get our fiscal house in
order. How many years did he say?
Conversation.
Do you know how many years? You worked for him, Mr. Vogt. How many years did he say?
He said he would work on getting a fiscal plan within 8 years.
8 years, right. 8 years, 2017 to 2024. How high does the CBO project the budget deficit to be in 2024 at the end of those 8 years?
We will still be looking at trillion-dollar deficits.
Over $1 trillion. Over $1 trillion, surpassing the federal deficit during President Obama's last year in office by nearly $500 billion. I want to jump quickly to veterans. The budget quotes President Trump's statement that, quote, it is our moral and solemn obligation to demonstrate to our veterans our continuing gratitude, unwavering support, and meaningful encouragement. Mr. Vogt, how is cutting veterans' disability benefits by rounding down cost of living increases consistent with this statement? Should we be making veterans pay for exploding deficits by denying them the full cost of living adjustments?
Sir, this budget has incredibly high increases for veteran spending. We have an 8%.
And why are you decreasing the cost of? Do you think the cost of living in the United States is going down for veterans?
We have an 8% increase for veteran spending. We fully.
I'm just asking why you're decreasing cost of living adjustments.
We do look for ways to improve programs to ensure that veterans programs over 10 years.
So it will improve lives for veterans by decreasing their cost of living adjustment? That's what you're saying, Mr. Vogt?
Proposals that have been proposed in the past, and we don't think they'll have any adverse impact on veterans.
No adverse impact. No adverse impact to decrease cost of living adjustments.
That's correct.
I think you should speak to some veterans, Mr. Vogt. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Vogt, for what you do. I've only gotten to serve with 2 presidents while I've been in Congress. President Obama, I believe, loved this country, but never once sent a budget to Capitol Hill that balanced ever. Not in 5 years, not in 10 years, not in 15 years, not in 60 years. And so I want you to know, I know you're making tough decisions, but I appreciate the President sending a budget that balanced. It was easy. We'd have done it by now, but we haven't. I was listening intently about the cuts that were going on. My first 2 years in Congress, we actually reduced total federal spending year over year, not funny Washington, D.C. math, but actual outlays declined 1 year to the next and then declined 1 year to the next, 2 years in a row. How often in your budget, in the President's budget proposal, are we spending less the next year than we were spending in the previous year?
In this the budget that we're proposing right now?
That's correct.
As it pertains to discretionary spending, we will be spending 2% less from one year to the next.
They undoubtedly, folks are looking for ways to cut what can be done in an efficient manner. But year over year, as I look at your numbers, you're investing more in America every year the next year than you did before. Now, in large part, that's because tax revenues are rising every year from one year to the next. We talk a lot about the tax proposal. That 1.9 trillion is adjusted by interest. The 1.5 trillion is realized by my constituents. That's going right into pockets back home. And to your point, only about 10% of our education dollars come from the Washington, D.C. area. Most of it comes from our county and from our state, and that's why we have some of the finest education programs in the nation. I appreciate you're not trying to supplant our local control in this budget. But I want to be clear. I'm looking at those tax revenue lines. They appear to increase not just one year, not just in the out years, but every single year of this budget. We are already collecting record tax revenues in this country. Is it your position that not only are we collecting more money today than we ever have in American history, but we're going to continue to collect more and more and more in every year of the president's budget? Absolutely.
And let me walk you through some of the specifics. In fiscal year 17, we received 3.31 trillion in revenues. In 2018, we will generate 3.329 in revenues. In 2019, we will generate 3.4 in revenues. In 2020, we will generate 3.6 trillion, and on and on. It's why over 10 years, we are confident that the economic policies of this administration, which we assume in our budget, CBO doesn't assume what is not current law, we assume that the economic policies of this administration will more than pay for the costs of the tax cut. We think that that's important from the standpoint, the tax cut was important from the standpoint of getting the economy going and allowing people to have more of their hard-earned money to be able to build and invest in their communities.
Let me get off script for a second. I think back to one of President Obama's budgets where he introduced chain CPI, something that Republicans had long been advocating for as responsible budgeting. The moment he put it in his budget, Republicans began to kick him in the shins for cutting benefits here, there, and elsewhere. Rather than taking yes for an answer, we turned it into a political talking point. I don't know the answer to this question, so I'm a little reluctant to ask it. But is there anything in the president's budget that perhaps I might like less as a conservative Republican, but my colleagues on the other side of the aisle maybe ought to take yes for an answer as opposed to turning president's budgets into political talking points as we do day in and day out?
I'm sure I'm going to get this question later on, but we believe that many of our Medicare reforms, which continue to increase Medicare spending every single year, but also allow for certain program integrity proposals to improve the programs, to be able to offer common sense reforms about ensuring that where you pay for particular services within Medicare applies no matter what the site of care is. These are proposals that were in President Obama's budget. We think that they are bipartisan reforms, and we think that if there's just a factual basis for understanding what we're proposing, that we can achieve common ground. But I fully expect to be walking through what the proposals are on Medicare later on in questioning.
Mr. Chairman, with your leadership, I know we'll be able to take yes for an answer in those places that we can. Folks will do what they have to do in this hearing today, but I sure do hope that where we do find agreement, we'll do it for the American people. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, and I might add, you said you went off script. I've never known you to be scripted.
Thank you.
I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Acting Budget Director, do corporate tax cuts pay for themselves, generally speaking?
We believe that the corporate tax cuts are very, very important for our economic growth numbers, and specifically because they lead to capital formulation in the years ahead. It's one of the more crucial provisions in the tax cut from the standpoint of ensuring that this is prolonged economic growth.
So is that a yes or no?
We believe over time, yes.
The most optimistic estimates of corporate tax cuts is that for every dollar that you give away, you can recapture about 32 cents. So that's about a 68% loss in terms of investment. And I don't think there's any credible evidence to suggest that these corporate tax cuts in and of themselves pay for themselves. So the deficit that everybody likes to talk about is a big problem, but we also have, as you know, a growth problem in the American economy. We hit 2.5% growth, which is not the 3 or 4% that the president had talked about. There's very little investment in here relative to infrastructure. Infrastructure, unlike corporate tax cuts, pay for themselves. For every dollar that you spend on infrastructure, you can expect minimally a $2 return. That's 100% return on investment as it relates to infrastructure. The disappointment here is that there's not a greater investment toward the growth of the American economy, because the last time we had 4% sustained growth over an 8-year period, we didn't have budgetary deficits. We had a budgetary surplus of almost $300 billion. I just want to move on to the issue of cancer research. This budget is showing that there'll be a cut in cancer research of about $900 million. What is the justification for that?
We keep NIH spending at a little bit above what it received in fiscal year 17 enacted. We think that the levels to which Congress has been appropriating money towards the National Institutes of Health is something that we can no longer sustain, although we are very supportive of the NIH spending. I just want you to tell you, as the father of a child with cystic fibrosis, we are on the verge of cutting-edge drugs that would prolong her life. So from the standpoint of the NIH, we're very supportive of the types of research that they perform. But I would also just say that no agency can spend well when they don't live in a resource-constrained world. And when we put forward proposals in Congress just without analysis, puts additional spending increases on the table, we actually think that that degrades the ability for NIH to do research.
So the justification for cutting general cancer research by $900 million is that the administration is focusing on other diseases from which to fund important research.
Generally, we take a top-line reduction for NIH and we allocate it across the board, with some exceptions like pediatric cancer. We are trying to prompt a debate, which we have for the first 2 budgets, about ways that NIH might be able to do things better if they didn't have as high administrative costs. They often pay more for administration costs than other private sector researchers, and we think that's a problem, and it's an important debate to have.
Yeah, but I think that, look, when you deal with cancer research in particular, you know, the only failure in the research is when you quit, or you're forced to quit because of lack of funding. The National Cancer Institute funds about 97% of all FDA-approved cancer drugs in the past 8 years. So, you know, new treatment that's delayed is new treatment that's denied. And at a time when you have incredible promise in the area of immunotherapy that is being clinically trialed and tested at places like Roswell Park Cancer Institute in Buffalo, New York, it just seems very short-sighted that the administration is picking winners and losers as it relates to what diseases we decide to invest in toward the goal of developing new promising treatments, because it costs not only money, but it also costs lives as well. With that, I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Holding, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Vogt. Like many of my friends that you're hearing from today, I'm deeply concerned about our mandatory spending trajectory. Today, mandatory spending accounts for 70% of the federal budget. In 10 years, mandatory spending plus our federal debt will consume all of our federal revenue. And despite this, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to actually increase mandatory spending through the creation of Medicare for all, free college tuition, and other things. Further, the interest payments on the debt are the fastest growing line item in our entire budget. This year, taxpayers will spend nearly $400 billion in debt interest alone. This is hundreds of billions of dollars that's being needlessly wasted because Congress has failed to address our massive debt problem. So without real reforms, mandatory spending will continue to crowd out discretionary spending, leaving less and less resources for other critical areas, including, of course, defense, which is our principal concern as a government. So, Mr. Vogt, the President's budget proposes over $2 trillion in mandatory reductions over 2 years, and that's good. So I'm going to give you the opportunity to expand a bit further on how you would achieve these $2 trillion of savings over 2 years, specifically the proposed changes to Medicaid and the payment structures of Medicare's Part B and D.
Thank you, Congressman. What I'd like to do is just unpack the $2.7 trillion in savings that we propose for in this budget. 1.9 trillion of those are reductions to mandatory, in savings and mandatory reforms. Again, these are programs that will continue to increase every year, so these are not cuts. These are savings over the life of the 10-year window. We achieve about $517 billion in savings in Medicare, as I've already mentioned. Many of the numbers that you've seen out in the press in the last 24 hours are inaccurate. And again, what we're trying to do in Medicare is lower drug prices. And when we lower drug prices, it has the result of achieving savings in Medicare. We also think it's important that Medicare doesn't pay for the uncompensated care within the Medicare program for people who are not Medicare beneficiaries. So again, we don't actually not pay for uncompensated care, but we move it outside the Medicare program with a slower rate of growth. Another big, large amount of savings is student loans. Student loans, we have about $209 billion in savings. Again, we think the proposal would benefit students, that right now there's a patchwork of all sorts of income-driven repayment plans. We provide one to be able to say 12.5% of your income you're going to be expected to repay your loans, but at the end of 15 years, you're done. At the end of 30 years, if you're a graduate student, you're done. We also think that welfare reform is important. We have about $300 billion in savings in welfare reform. Much of it is simply with the proposal to have a work requirement within different programs such that like housing, food stamps, Medicaid, and we have hardship exemptions within these. No one is wanting people who can't work to be able to work, but we do value work, and it's something from the standpoint of human dignity. We want to be able to transition individuals and families and households to self-sufficiency. We saw that in the historic reforms in the 1990s. We have long said we want to build on it. We do that in this budget.
Thank you. And I appreciate you going forward, with a timely budget. And I really urge the chairman and my friends on the other side of the aisle to come forward with a budget yourselves. I think it's important for the American people to see where we're coming from. And budgets sometimes are described as aspirational, but I do think they serve a very important purpose of setting forth in real concrete dollars and cents terms to the American people where we want to go with issues, were we able to wave that magic wand and get 218 people to agree with us in how we want to go forward. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to get some facts out, not in any partisan way. Your budget proposal, as you put it, reduces Medicare spending by $845 billion. You describe it as efficiency and reduction of waste, but is that correct?
No, it's not correct. There is a gross federal savings for Medicare line in the budget, but when you add back the proposals that we include for an uncompensated care pool outside of Medicare for children's GME, Medicare.
Now, what is the number when you add that?
The number is about $517 billion in savings.
So you're saying that it reduces Medicare spending by not 500 billion. The report suggests that 500 billion of this quote-unquote savings would go to the deficit. You're saying it's less than that?
No, so right now, I thought you were asking about the number that has been reported in the press, $845 billion.
Now, what would you say is the accurate number?
The accurate number, again, we increase Medicare spending every year. This is not a...
Not a long answer, just give me a number.
I'm providing an answer for you. $517 billion in savings within Medicare over 10 years is the net Medicare savings number.
So you're going to cut by $517 billion?
No, sir. Medicare spending, as I mentioned, will continue to rise each and every year.
Okay, but you're reducing the Medicare budget by $517 billion.
We are identifying savings that would result from common sense proposals like reducing drug pricing costs. Obviously,
have you endorsed the dogged bill on that?
Medicare.
Would you be open to the dogged bill, which reduces drug costs? I mean, I know you're saying let's reduce drug costs, and that's a great thought, but what specifically, how are you going to do it? So far, the president hasn't supported the dogged bill. The president hasn't supported any bills. I mean, would you commit today that the dogged bill, which actually could reduce costs, you would consider supporting that?
We'll certainly look at analyzing any piece of legislation that's out there as it pertains to drug proposals.
Does the president have legislation on how he's going to achieve these drug reductions?
We do.
What is the legislation? Is there HR or Senate bill? I mean, what legislation is he supporting?
We're happy to work with Congress. We're hoping that Congress...
But has he proposed any legislation?
We have proposals that we hope you turn into...
Has anyone introduced the legislation?
We're working with Congress.
I know you're working, then what legislation is there? I mean, there are thousands of bills introduced. Is there a single bill the president's introduced to be able to get the savings that you want?
Congressman, we don't introduce bills.
No, but you suggest bills. I mean, have you proposed, and you do, I mean, you wrote the tax bill. I mean, we
specifically propose policies that Congress can turn
But you haven't worked with any single member of Congress to introduce any legislation to get this $500-some billion of reduction that you say you want.
I don't think that's true. I think that...
Is there a single member of Congress or bill you can point to?
I think the Health and Human Service Department has an active legislative office that is working to turn these policies into actual proposals.
I don't want to belabor it, but if you could maybe submit for the record what legislation we can get behind that would get $517 billion of drug cost savings. So far, I only know the dogged bill. I mean, maybe there's some other magic solution. The other thing I want to quickly go over is you propose $1 billion of cuts in the National Science Foundation. Is that correct?
We have cuts to the National Science
Foundation. I was with Secretary Condoleezza Rice the other day. She's near my district at Stanford. She said the single biggest thing we can do for the national security of this country is double our National Science Foundation. Would it be accurate to say the president would disagree with her characterization?
No, we have, in a time of $1 trillion deficits, we believe that $7 billion for the National Science Foundation is a very healthy budget. And I know,
but you would disagree with her characterization that we need to double it. By definition, you're saying we need to cut it by $1 billion, correct?
We think that the National Science Foundation is very important. We think
I get all that, but you would disagree with her characterization that we need to double the budget. I mean, your budget on the...
I had a conversation with Secretary Rice about this. I would just point out that the National Science Foundation doesn't need to be immune from looking at waste, fraud, and abuse. To the extent that they spend money on winemaking programs, they're supposed to be investing in science, and yet we still find that waste, fraud, and abuse is not something that they are free from. That's the conversation we want to have.
And you're cutting the National Institute of Health budget by $4.9 billion. Is that correct?
We bring the National Institutes of Health down to about $33 billion.
Do you see why, I mean, not trying to be partisan, do you see why some people may think that you don't believe in science and technology when you're cutting the National Science Foundation by $1 billion, when you're cutting the National Institute of Health by $4 billion, which the Republican Congress, by the way, increased $2 billion last time, and when you're disagreeing with people like Condoleezza Rice? I mean, do you see why that perception might be there?
I don't believe I understand why the perception would be there, because we look at the fact that we're spending $134 billion in research and development. That's exactly what we spent in the last 2 years. Now, we allocate it differently, but it's something that we prioritize a great deal.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Stewart, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm going to move fairly quickly. There's a couple things I want to hit that I think are important. First, Mr. Vogt, thank you for being here. I can't imagine you slept very well last night. This has got to be one of your least favorite days of the year, coming here. And frankly, we talk about, Mr. Woodall talked about going off script. I think we're fairly following the script, and that is some of the things we say are very predictable. And I'm sure you anticipated some of that. And And I do wish some of our colleagues would give you a chance to answer the questions that they present before you. I think it's common courtesy to give you a chance to respond. I'd like to go through, for the benefit again of some of our colleagues on this committee, two very simple economic facts, just economic realities, and allow you to respond to them, to either agree or disagree if you'd like. The first is that deficits are a function of two things, and only two things. And this is simple math. This doesn't take a genius at all to figure this out. Deficits are a function of revenue and spending. You take the difference of those two things, what the government takes in and what the government spends, and that is your deficit, or in some cases, your surplus. Would you agree with that? That's very simple, true?
Yes, Congressman.
Okay, thank you. And so can you have an honest conversation about deficits and only talk about revenue, only talk about some tax policy that either increased or decreased the revenue, or do you have to talk about spending as well?
You have to talk about spending.
Of course you do, because it's those two things. And I think anytime we have a conversation on this committee where we are pointing the finger at deficits and only talking about tax policy, it's fundamentally a dishonest conversation at that moment, because you have to consider spending as well. And I'll give you a good example, and I'll bet you know this, because you're obviously very, very bright, and it's amazing to me that you can come up with these numbers and answers off the top of your head as a very, very complicated and intricate budget. But going back to when I was younger, Ronald Reagan was famous for tax cuts. And yet after the '82 recession, I'm curious, do you know what happened to government revenue after those tax cuts and the recession was over?
The revenue increased.
Every year that he was in office, every year after the recession, his government revenue increased because of his tax cuts. And once again, I think that's just an economic fact, that you can have economic growth which leads to revenue increases as a result of tax cuts. And again, it's dishonest argument when you are not willing to recognize that. I'd ask you to respond to what I've said here, proposed. Is there anything that you would add or that you think is worth emphasizing?
I just think that it's important to reflect on the fact that in the 1960s, we had spending and taxes as a percent of GDP roughly in the 16% range. Since the 1960s, we have seen spending skyrocket to in the neighborhood of 22% as a percentage of GDP, whereas revenues have ticked up to be in the neighborhood of 17%. The last 50-year average is around 17%. So one of the reasons why we think it's important to maintain revenues where they are and not go in that direction is that revenues under this budget, even though they have a slight dip in the short term, will average at exactly their 50-year average of 17.3%. So we think spending is the problem. We've been upfront about that, and that's not even getting into the fact that when you are raising taxes, not only are you increasing the burden of the American people, but you're also worsening the economy, and we wouldn't want to do that either.
Well, and so you had a more technical and precise way of making the point that I just made, and I appreciate that. I want to hit something really quickly in a minute and 10 seconds. I was a former military member, Air Force pilot. When I was flying, we had something like 156 fighter squadrons. Several years ago, we had 57. 156 down to 57. When I was flying, there was no question in the world that we were the best military in the world, and that we could take on any adversary and win and defeat them in combat. And as you may have seen in a recent RAND study and some others, there are serious questions about whether that remains true. Would you address the importance of increasing the military spending and why that is a priority for you and for this president?
It's very important. I just talked with him about it yesterday, and the importance of this $750 billion defense budget being used to procure the aircraft that we need, the battleships that we need, the research and development that we need, the missile defense that we need, 110 new aircrafts, 12 battleships putting online with this budget. It continues to be something that is a major priority. Look, the president wants the world to know that we have the most awe-inspiring military that has ever been known in the world. We believe that we can have peace through strength. He does not want to have the perception that this is about promulgating endless wars. You know the president has had a long conversation with the American people about that. He wants to be able to continue to increase and rebuild this military so that we don't have to fight wars in the future, because the world knows that we're the strongest military on the face of the planet.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Sears.
Mr. Voigt, thank you for being here. Mr. Voigt, if these tax bills, the tax cuts, do not deliver what you're projecting, are you going back to cut more of the Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security programs?
We think they will deliver, sir. We believe that over the life...
Well, let's make a projection they don't.
Again, we think that the most accurate way to look at the next 10 years is to assume the economic growth assumptions that we've put forward of 3%. Over the first 2 years, we have been the most accurate administration in history. We projected 2.5% and 3.1% when Larry Summers said that that was ridiculous and outrageous and that we were delusional. Instead, we not only hit those numbers, but we have been the most accurate. And so we think that over 10 years...
Well, let's say you're not as accurate.
Okay.
Where would you go to get the money?
It will mean, we're not suggesting that we're going to make any changes to the budgets, although the aspect about budget is that you look at what is coming in and you look at what's going out, and each and every year you make adjustments. That's the importance of the federal budget process. It is certainly broken. I agree with the chairman and the ranking member that we can certainly make reforms. But I would also say that, look, that budgets are about putting our visions forward for the American people. And as I mentioned last night,
I get all that, you know.
But the importance
let's bring it to something more local. I'm sure many members here serve in local office. Why is it that the president and the people always feel that eliminating the community development block grants are necessary? I mean, this is a program which helps communities that cannot apply for other fundings. So yet, every year you want to eliminate this program. This is a tax saver for the communities. I just don't understand why they feel it's necessary to just abolish. Have you talked to people who serve in local office and have used these grants?
We have spoken with those people. We look at this program and we've looked at it, its record since 1972, 74, when it was initiated, and it's about $170 billion that we have spent on this program, and we have seen no economic results as a result of it in terms of...
Well, look, I disagree with you there. I have served local office, and many people here have served in local offices. Mm-hmm. This is a tax saver for that community. Rather than increasing taxes in the community, you get a grant for $100,000 to do a street. That means you don't pass it on to the taxpayers. So
all of those taxpayers, sir, are federal taxpayers as well, and we have $1 trillion deficit that we can't afford.
I agree with you. And this tax cut doesn't help.
We think it does. We think that it puts more money in the pockets of harder working American people to be able to spend.
I hate to disagree with you, but
their communities.
It's already hurting New Jersey badly. We're probably one of the states that are hurt the most by these tax cuts. The other issue that I have problems with is cutting affordable house money. Have you made any contingency plan once you start cutting these programs that you're going to have more homeless people on the streets? What are you going to do for those people?
Our budget projections, and I appreciate the question, because one of the questions that's at the top of my mind every time we write the budget for the Department of Housing and Urban Development is to make sure that we're not causing homelessness. I don't want any of the proposals that we put forward to have that result in any way. So all of the reforms that you have in here would not lead to additional homelessness, but the reality is that we have housing programs that are on, because they're contingent on local rent rates, which are increasing, that the housing programs are almost acting like a mandatory program in the drain that they have within the discretionary budget. So we are trying to put forward reforms and update.
Where do veterans fit on this? I mean, we need housing for veterans. And if we cut affordable housing, where do veterans fit in all this?
Again, we don't think that there'll be any increase in homelessness as a result of this budget. We have a healthy, ongoing increase of 7.5% for the Department of Veterans Affairs, specifically because we don't want to ensure, we want to ensure that veterans are fully funded.
My time is up. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. I now recognize Mr. Johnson of Ohio for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Acting Director Vogt, I really appreciate you being here today to present the President's budget request. And I appreciate that this budget addresses the mounting problem of unsustainable debt that we're facing in our country, especially on the mandatory side of the ledger, where about 70% of federal spending happens, as well as discretionary policies to right-size the government so that it works for all Americans. I also think the proposal to continue the tax relief provided by the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is a wise policy, given what we heard from the CBO director earlier this year, that increasing taxes, which would obviously be a requirement to fund all of the new spending programs that my colleagues on the other side are presenting, that increasing taxes would dampen economic growth, job creation, and wage increases. So I'm glad to see that the budget proposes, a proposal includes $2 trillion in savings from reforms to mandatory programs. Director Vogt, do you agree that mandatory spending is the true driver of our debt?
I think it is a definite driver of our debt and our spending problem, certainly structurally in the years ahead, particularly after the 10-year window. But I wouldn't want there to be an impression that discretionary spending is also not a driver of our national debt. We have 30% that is spent on discretionary spending. We have $1 trillion non-defense budgets every single year. And I think one of the things that this budget is trying to articulate and prompt a conversation with Congress about is that we often say that we're for getting a handle on mandatory spending, and then we pass $350 billion budget agreements that we can't afford because we've never grappled with the paradigm between $1 of non-defense increase for $1 of defense. And the problem with that is, A, we think we need to have a debate about all of those non-defense dollars, and we want to find waste for abuse as well in defense dollars. I don't want to let that off the table.
But I want to get to the mandatory side of the ledger because we don't work over there. I mean, I get all of the discretionary and defense spending. I get that. But as you mentioned, that's a very small part of what the federal government spends. And even if we zeroed out all of that, the spending curve is still going in the wrong direction. So again, would you agree that mandatory spending is the biggest driver of our national debt?
It is a very, very large driver of our national
How can you
debt.
say it's not the biggest driver if it's two-thirds of what we're spending?
Because I don't want to leave the impression that discretionary spending...
I didn't say it wasn't important. I didn't say discretionary wasn't important, but we've got to continue to make the case that mandatory spending is the main driver, and without that, without addressing it, we're never going to get out of this debt crisis we're in. So could you outline some of the key mandatory spending reforms that are proposed in the budget?
Sure. We have proposals to find savings in student loans by consolidating programs and offering one student debt income repayment plan. We have savings and reforms in welfare to provide a work requirement in welfare and expand the current work requirement to other programs. We have savings and reforms to federal retirement benefits to more appropriately align with the private sector. We have reforms to health care, to continue to repeal and replace Obamacare and find savings in that. We want to restore balance in Medicaid, and we offer a state health care block grant that lowers the cost so that we can allow states to target the most directly eligible participants in Medicaid so that Medicaid focuses on those individuals. So we have $1.9 trillion in mandatory savings. I don't want you to come away with the view that we don't think it's absolutely important. But I do want to prompt the debate to suggest that to the extent that we just say mandatory is the problem, so we're going to keep increasing discretionary. And then when we do these cap deals and the mandatory savings that were at least in the first two rounds and not the third, the mandatory reforms that we're talking about are not the type that are in our budget. They're things like extending user fees They're extending laws that were already in place. We don't think that that's actually the types of reforms that allow us to fix the exact problem that you're addressing, but I do appreciate the question.
Okay, all right. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Mr. Vogt, for being here. Your budget assumes long-term growth rates that are a full percentage point above the projections by CBO and the Federal Reserve and most private forecasters. And it's one thing to wish for economic growth that's 50% stronger than everyone else. It's another thing to build your budget based on it. You've explained the basis for your confidence in your 3% projection, but what would the deficit impact be if the economy grew around 2% over the long run, as most other forecasters believe?
Sure, thanks for the question. My answer is two parts. Number one, we've had an understanding that has turned out to be true that our economic policies would lead to growth. We projected over the first 2 years of this budget, we were the most accurate administration in history.
I don't mean to I just have a little bit of time. I want to hear your answer, but what would it be if it were 2%? I understand you believe it was.
We haven't run alternative scenarios because we believe that we're going to be vindicated when it comes to the growth rates that we've assumed in this budget. In part of your question was why do we think that 3%?
No, I didn't ask that because you addressed that before. I asked what would it be if it was 2%, and I think that the problem is that, as your mom taught you, pray for the best but plan for the worst. We're pretty exposed if growth comes in around 2%, and we haven't planned for it. Let me ask you a question about energy. Your budget cuts energy research and development programs by more than 60%, while eliminating tax benefits for businesses and households that invest in renewable energy, energy efficiency, and electric vehicles. But the administration's own assessments conducted by independent evaluation experts show that the Department of Energy's clean energy programs have provided at least $7 in benefits for every $1 invested, and probably much more, compared to what the private sector would have achieved on its own. We talk about dynamic scoring in the context of tax cuts, but here's an example where we're getting a return on our investment. Why would your budget slash programs that are successfully supporting U.S. innovation, competitiveness, and job creation in emerging clean energy industries that are also protecting the environment and public health?
We believe that in a time of trillion-dollar deficits, that the resources that the Department of Energy has should be devoted towards basic research that would not otherwise be done by the private sector. It should not be focused on applied research that are the types of activities that the private sector could continue to do. That said, we fully fund basic R&D. We keep all the labs open, and we are cognizant of this important activity being funded by the private sector.
I notice your budget proposes larger cuts for renewable energy and energy efficiency than for well-established and highly profitable fossil fuel industries. Is there a reason for that?
There is not a specific reason. When we set those budgets...
Do you believe that the fossil fuel extraction industries still need propping up?
We have generally taken an approach of all of the above from an energy perspective in this budget. We do have some specific investments. For instance, we have a new fast test reactor to support the nuclear industry, which is something that many experts say is absolutely vital to have a thriving nuclear industry.
I was just referring to the tax support for fossil fuel extraction.
Sure. Again, our tax policies are over time, we're trying to align with our view that spending, in this case subsidies, should be devoted towards basic R&D as opposed to more later stage.
Maybe we'll get to an equal treatment over time. With respect to the border, responsible border governance includes protecting migrants and honoring our national and international obligations for asylum claims. There's thousands of asylum-seeking women, children, and men. Whatever you think of the law as it is, we need to process those folks. How does the budget increase our capacity to process asylum claims quickly and humanely? And specifically, are we putting more money into asylum officers and other related personnel? If so, how much?
Happy to get back to you on what we're specifically providing for asylum officers, but it's an absolute priority of this budget to deal with the emergency on our southern border.
Great.
We continue to request funding for the humanitarian crisis that we actually found common agreement with this body on.
I'd like to hear from that. I guess the other question I had is, you got 171 Customs and Border Protection officers in the budget. designated as Office of Field Operations Officers to staff ports of entry. We'd like to see clarity on that as well. We want to make sure that that's
Happy to provide that,
way.
sir.
Finally, any thoughts on the effectiveness of IRS enforcement? Do they need more resources to be more effective and to make sure that everyone's paying their fair share of taxes?
We do think that the IRS needs a dollar spent for IRS collection is a dollar well spent, and it's one of the reasons that we have a program integrity cap adjustment in this budget to make sure that IRS gets the necessary resources within this budget, and it actually causes us to be able to generate savings over the life of the 10-year window.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired.
Thank the gentleman. I now recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Voigt. I appreciate you coming today and presenting the President's budget. Let me just make a comment. You know, I think I join most Americans who are tired of hearing big numbers. They're tired of hearing deficits. They know something's not right, and they want it done now. And while I would have liked to have seen more cuts in this budget, at least it's a start. And I heard, in fact, it was yesterday, one of the de facto leader, the new leader of the Democratic Party, when they asked her how she was going to pay for free medical care, free education. She said, "We just are." And I've got a solution. And I'm from the private sector. I'm a real estate developer. Here's my solution. I will go along with her free medical care, get the doctors to work for free. I will go along with the free education, get the tenured professors to work for free. That solves the whole problem, and maybe even let Congress work for free, sacrifice our salaries. That being said, I keep hearing about the wall, you know, the dollars funding for the wall. Will you agree that not having any type border security is costing this country a dollar amount?
Yes, I would.
Would you entertain maybe $111 billion a year, more or less?
We haven't done any specific analysis along those lines, but we definitely think that there are savings that over time we would be able to achieve by continuing to invest in our border, and we think it's a very, very important aspect of this budget is to secure the necessary resources along our southwest border.
So your $8.6 billion, there will be a return on investment, and it's far more, even in 12 months, than spending than the cost.
We believe there'll be a return. I wouldn't want to anchor it specifically in a dollar amount.
The rescission package that most of my friends on the left voted against, which basically took unallocated escrow dollars, is that taken into account in this budget?
The rescission, the bill that we sent up last year, it is. This is one of the ways that we go from the 5% cut from the fiscal year 19 level. We take that down with a 5% cut to be in the 560s, and then the rest is to be able to use many of the same rescissions that Congress has used in the past. Money that was never going to be spent within children's health insurance program. Again, this was money that was not going to be spent. Congress since 2011 has used these chimps, these rescissions, to the tune of $58 billion. And yet, the minute that we try to use that to actually deal with our deficit or to remove them from the appropriations process so that they can't be used as an offset, somehow we're hurting families and children's health insurance programs. So, yes, we do rely on them to get down to the actual cap level, and we think that we know there will be absolutely no impact on children's health programs.
What you just said was exactly what Mick Mulvaney said when he mentioned he could not understand why there was any argument over this $15 billion in cuts. The money couldn't be used even if they wanted it to, so this is not a cut. Let's go over what Mr. Johnson mentioned about you would agree that the biggest cost to or I guess the biggest factor is mandatory spending.
Again, I would agree that it is one of the largest drivers, and I might actually agree that it's the biggest. But when I say that, I'm trying to avoid conceding the fact that we have not dealt with our discretionary problem, and that in many ways is how you start as a country getting a hold of your fiscal challenges is by identifying the waste and the abuse and the inefficiencies in the votes that members take every single year. This is the process that's not on an autopilot. And so what we're trying to prompt a debate with this Congress is to say, yes, let's talk about mandatory spending. We've proposed more savings in any president's budget in history, but not at the expense of continuing to increase agencies year over year and what they're allowed to spend, because quite frankly, those have a significant impact on the American people.
Well, I appreciate this effort, and I appreciate you presenting a budget that is the first step in this long stairway of getting financially independent and not leaving our children with a $70,000 debt for every man, woman, and child in this country. And thank you for your efforts. Look forward to working with you further, and I yield the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you for your testimony. I chair the Subcommittee on Health, and as I review the portions of your budget concerning prescription drugs, you know, I think my main complaint is that the folks who prepared this budget didn't listen carefully to President Trump. You do, on page 41, say that you quote him as saying one of his greatest priorities is reducing the cost of prescription drugs, but when it comes to doing anything to achieve that objective, I think your proposal accomplishes as little as his Rose Garden press conferences and the last 2 years in which the prices of prescription drugs have continued to go up. President Trump did not campaign on a slogan, "Elect me and the price of prescription drugs won't go up quite as fast as it has been over the last few years." He talked about bringing the cost of prescription prices down. He said, and he said it very boldly, that we could save billions of dollars by what he called bidding on prescription drugs. Outside estimates are that hundreds of billions of dollars could be saved not only for Medicare beneficiaries, but for the taxpayers on Medicare if we had an effective prescription drug negotiation proposal. As you know, I have one. I think Mr. Connor referred to it. 120 members of this House have signed on to that proposal. Whether you like the specifics of it or not, all I want to know is whether the administration, your office, currently agrees with what President Trump said, that an important part of addressing the cost of prescription drugs is direct Medicare negotiation for the prices of those drugs.
Sir, President Trump has not put forward those policies in this.
He hasn't proposed what he advocated as a candidate?
This administration has put forward a number of proposals to lower drug costs. We see many of the same issues.
But Medicare prescription drug negotiation is not one of them, and are you against it?
We have not proposed those policies as an administration.
It doesn't mean you're against it, you're just kind of agnostic on it?
I think we want to have we want to continue to have a conversation with Congress about
all of
the proposals that you all have put forward, similar to how we would do an infrastructure.
Well, I want to talk about that. I want to talk about that next, because I have some questions about that as well. But I want that genuine conversation. Let me ask you a more specific issue. You and all of our colleagues are well aware of the opioid crisis we have in this country. Big Pharma has exploited that crisis by raising the cost by 700% of the life-saving opioid overdose drug naloxone. It's a burden that's borne largely by our first responders, by our police, our firefighters, and our EMS, and taxes local taxpayers to provide it. President Trump's own opioid commission recommended that we at least negotiate the price of naloxone. And last week in the House Oversight hearing, the Office of National Drug Control Policy Director Jim Carroll, part of your administration, said he couldn't agree more with the need to negotiate the prices of naloxone. Could you agree we at least ought to do that and help our first responders provide this life-saving drug at a reasonable price instead of be gouged by Big Pharma?
I would defer to the statements of the other members of the administration that have been more acutely involved in this issue, and happy to work with you on lowering the cost of drug prices.
Thank you. Now, you mentioned infrastructure. We've gone now over 2 years, and all we have now is the same one-page description of the President's plan that we had this time last year. I say all we have because it actually includes 1/3 less in resources than you provided in the one-pager last year. You propose in this same budget that you solve the people that are stuck in traffic all over America today by cutting the Department of Transportation budget by 20%. I don't see how cutting the transportation budget by 20%, reducing by a third the amount of resources that you want to provide, is going to get people out of the gridlock that we have all over the country today. We need a bolder infrastructure program, and just like on prescription drugs, we need this administration to lead. That's the only way our Republican colleagues can be supportive of the revenue needed to deal with our infrastructure problems. We were told only last week in the Ways and Means Committee that it will take $160 billion over the next 10 years just to keep the third-rate system we've got now. If we're going to upgrade it, we have to have more revenue, more resources to do that. Finally, with reference to education, I'm greatly troubled that at a time when we face a physician shortage, a growing shortage, you propose to eliminate all of the loan forgiveness programs that are available to get those physicians as well as law enforcement and teachers into underserved areas. This is a great step backwards, as are your cuts in student financial assistance. I hope you'll reconsider those. I do hope that our Republican colleagues, because this does so much embody the values of the Trump administration, will put your entire budget up for a vote. We need an up or down vote on your budget as you proposed it, 100% the way it is, to see whether they want to go along with these cuts to education, to health care, to Medicare, and not doing enough about prescription drugs. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Would the witness care to respond to any of that? Or I don't think there was a question there, but.
Just briefly on infrastructure spending, it continues to be a major priority of this administration. We put forward $200 billion, which is the same amount of previous budgets. From the standpoint of why less detail, I do think it's an important clarification. We're responding to the fact that the further details that you all have soundly not proposed legislation as a result of, you have your own views as to how we could structure an infrastructure package. We want to allow you to do that, and we're very interested in what you all send our way.
With all due respect, is that your response to why you cut the Department of Transportation by 20% and why you reduced the amount of total resources from $1.5 trillion last year to $1 trillion this year?
Yeah, just real briefly.
Looks like you're going backwards.
It's not going backwards, sir. As you know, when the last CAPS deal was struck and there was a substantial increase in non-defense spending above what we allocated for our budget, we asked Congress to say, use a portion of that non-defense spending to really invest on the discretionary side of the transportation department. It was in some respects, a one-time bump. The Department of Transportation is being set at above the fiscal year 17 level, so we feel like we are continuing high levels of infrastructure and continue to be committed to it in the years ahead.
Okay, the gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Hearn, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Vogt, I want to thank you for testifying today, and I appreciate your work and this administration's commitment to lowering our national debt, protecting our nation's borders, and rebuilding our military, the greatest threats to our national sovereignty. You know, as a reminder to us all here, the federal government has no money. It only has our taxpayers' money, and we're supposed to be good stewards of that. And most out there outside the Beltway would say we've been a terrible steward of the money that we have sent us now. You know, unlike a majority of the politicians in Washington, D.C., I've been a small business owner for over 30 years, a job creator, on the other side of the legislation and the laws that we've passed. And it's refreshing to see an administration operating its budget as efficiently as a business. As I know, and as the President knows, in business there are three things to consider when evaluating a budget. Either there's a revenue problem, a spending problem, or both. Just as a small business owner, my business has never had an open checkbook. We had to make a budget just like a house. We couldn't spend more than we bring in. When a business person needs to raise revenue, he or she has three options. They can raise prices, which results in our customers going to a competitor to get a better deal, increase sales, meaning your existing customers buy more per product, or increase your customer base, meaning you get more new customers coming through the door. Similarly, when the government needs to raise revenues, it can raise taxes, which will discourage innovation, entrepreneurship, and economic activity, or stimulate the economy by cutting taxes. We see this working with the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, with companies giving out large bonuses, benefits increases, and raises. Or increase the number of people working by deregulating businesses. When the government gets out of the way, it allows for businesses to grow and hire, which results in a larger taxpayer base. which again, we have seen this in the Trump administration's enacting this basic principle, and it's working terrifically. In fact, I think you call it MAGAnomics. My questions to you are, some critics contend that your economic forecast is overly optimistic. Nevertheless, isn't your forecast, which sees real economic growth of averaging 2.9% a year in line with the long-term average historical growth rate of the GDP here in the United States, roughly 3%?
I've never done the math that way, but I'll trust your facts.
Okay, always like that. Regarding work requirements, does the President agree that the aim of government assistance programs should be to move as many people as possible off public assistance and into self-sufficiency?
We do. We want to ensure that we maintain a social safety net that's important to provide the basic necessities, but we don't want that to be the permanent situation for families across this country. We want to move families and individuals to self-sufficiency. It's one of the reasons that we believe that welfare reform is so important. It's one of the reasons why we believe that work is so important. Even though we do provide certain hardship exemptions, we know that there are some exceptions that are needing to be provided, but we want to be able to increase human dignity by encouraging people to work and getting them to self-sufficiency and off of federal programs.
I appreciate the President's wanting to help those who need help, but those who can help themselves need to find a job. There are plenty of jobs out there. In fact, after the tax reform plan was enacted, many economists boosted their forecasts of U.S. economic growth over the next few years. CBO projected Tax Cuts and Jobs Act will create approximately 1 million jobs over the next decade. How much do you think the tax reform has boosted the economy's growth potential?
Well, we think that the tax cuts are one of the major aspects of our economic program, and we think of the economic program as holistically. We think that it will lead to 3% economic growth in the years ahead, which if you really unpack that, what's going on there? What separates the difference between our numbers and, say, CBO's numbers? And it's because we are assuming that businesses will invest in capital formulation. We look at the fact that non-residential fixed income has increased by 7%. What does that look like? That businesses investing in their companies and expanding it, leading to additional jobs. And that's why there are long-term implications. This is not just some juicing of the economy. This is long structural change to our economic growth that will pay dividends for decades.
Thank you, Mr. Vogt. I'd like to also point out that under the Trump administration, we've seen unprecedented job creation with unemployment at 50-year lows across all sectors, with record low unemployment of minority and women. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Director, do I understand you to say that the tax cuts are going to pay for themselves?
The economic program, of which the tax cuts is a major part, yes, we believe will pay for themselves.
Okay. When you talk about tax cuts, do some tax cuts create better economic stimulation than others?
We do think that there are tax policies do not come in the same ability to impact economic growth. But we do think that the policies that were contained
and the ones that stimulate the best are those aimed at the low and moderate income ranges, and the least effective are corporate and high income tax cuts.
No, we wouldn't say that. We would say that the policies that are included in the tax cut that the President signed.
You would not say that tax cuts aimed at low and moderate income stimulate the economy better than those for corporations and the high income?
From a standpoint of economic growth, no, I would not rank those higher in terms of their ability to provide long-term economic growth. I would say that the policies that were included are all important for various economic reasons.
Thank you. One former member said he'd never been here with a balanced budget. You can see that I have been here when we had a balanced budget. In fact, there's a pattern on that. If you look at the blue areas, each blue president, going back to President Carter, had a better deficit than he started, and every red president, going back to Nixon, ended up worse than they started. Is that true?
I note your chart. I also note that President Clinton benefited from a Republican Congress that was committed to balancing the budget.
And he had to shut down the government to stop them from messing up his budget. So don't give them any credit for for going into surplus. In fact, when Bush came in, can you tell me what, what happened during the Bush administration with the Republican Congress that messed up the budget?
It did lead to an increase in the deficit.
That's right. What did they do to accomplish that feat?
We are not here to say that spending control has not been a bipartisan problem. We're saying the exact opposite.
Wait a minute. We already established that under Democratic presidents it gets better, under Republican presidents it gets worse. Under the education budget, it's been pointed out that you cut the education department by how much? About 12%, is that right?
We we contributed another $50 billion to education, so we think that more than offsets the 12% reduction that you note in terms of Department of Education.
Okay, and the $5 billion, is it $5 billion a year choice program?
It is.
$50 billion over 10 years. How do you limit it to $5 billion? Where do we get some details on the program?
We're happy to provide additional details from the Department of Education. It is an amount of money that we felt was that we could justify in the current deficit.
The details, how do you limit it? On April 15th, when people file their taxes, how do you know it's going to only be $5 billion?
Treasury will be providing guidance. If you all see fit to enact it into law, states will have quite a bit of discretion to design their programs. Their discretion would be based on Treasury rules that.
So this thing would have to get through Congress before.
Absolutely.
You could, and you don't have any details yet. On the student loan crisis, what do you do for to help students pay off their student loans? So I understand you cut student loan assistance by over $200 billion.
We find savings in student loan programs, but we feel like we have put forward a proposal.
Savings like eliminating the public service loan forgiveness program, subsidized loans and payments for account maintenance fees?
We consolidate programs to be able to offer one student income-driven repayment plan that we think will provide certainty and allow anyone that's receiving a payment now to be eligible under that. And we think it'll be certainty and very generous. After 15 years, you can walk away from your debt, and for a graduate student, after 30 years, you can walk away.
And how does that change present law?
As it consolidates, it puts forward a new proposal to do that.
Does your budget recognize the pending multi-employer pension fund crisis?
We do. We put forward premium increases to be able to further.
Premium increases are not going to deal with the hundreds of billions of dollars we're going to be on the hook for if these plans go broke. Do you have a plan to address the multi-employer pension fund crisis? We've had studies at our last hearing on the Education Committee that showed that there will be hundreds of billions of dollars in adverse impact on the federal budget. These things go broke because pensioners will not be paying as much tax. They're going to be more likely to use food stamps and Medicaid, and it'll have an impact of hundreds of billions of dollars if we don't do something. Is there a proposal to do something?
It's not the proposal that we might agree on, but there is a proposal to address this. We definitely
do you agree?
See an issue.
Do you recognize the adverse impact that doing nothing will have?
Absolutely. We don't want that to happen.
Is that in the budget?
We have a proposal that's in the budget to increase premiums to deal with some of these pension crises.
And that's it?
Gentleman's time has expired. Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Muser of Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Vogt, thank you for coming before the committee today. In the fiscal year 2020 budget, your office has outlined a plan to invest in important programs that are central to many Americans, while also reducing our discretionary spending and reducing the growth of mandatory spending. I am concerned about our nation's rising debt, and I do appreciate the fact that the President is putting us on a plan that moves us toward fiscal responsibility by decreasing spending on non-defense discretionary programs by 5% next year, as well as reducing mandatory spending growth through reforms targeted at waste, fraud, and abuse, and lowering drug prices, and as well as welfare reform. Our federal revenue growth projected for 2020 is 4.9%. Does that number ring true with you? 4.9%. Yes. Most states in our country would love to have that sort of revenue growth. The only ones that probably have it would occur after a sizable tax increase. 4.9% revenue growth is is very strong. Of course, our problem is that our spending levels are quite a bit higher than that. Would you say it is accurate that during the previous administration, President Obama presidency, that our debt, our national debt went from $9.5 trillion to $19.5 trillion in an 8-year period?
Sounds about right.
Sounds about right. Can you quantify the general impact of the Affordable Care Act on our current mandatory spending levels? I think it's roughly, well, why don't you answer first, please?
Sure. It's a sizable aspect of our mandatory programs, healthcare expenditures in general, from Medicare to Medicaid to the Affordable Care Act's expansions of Medicaid and their exchange premiums collectively absorb a very large portion of the mandatory side.
Right. And in spite of there being various taxes that went along with the Affordable Care Act, would it be fair to say that our current deficit has approximately $300 billion to $400 billion in it due to the Affordable Care Act, increasing the debt by as much as $300 to $400 billion this current year or in 2020?
I haven't looked at those numbers recently, but I take your word for it.
My colleagues on the other side of the dais argue that this year's projected deficit is grown by the enactment of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. My understanding is that this does add to the deficit, but approximately $150 billion. Is that about accurate?
The Affordable Care Act certainly did not help us from a federal spending trajectory. I would certainly agree with that.
Right. Okay. But the tax cuts, the deficit, current deficit, the tax cuts have attributed to approximately in current year or in the next fiscal year about $150 billion. Closing rapidly, but $150 billion.
Yes, that's about right.
Okay. And then since the enactment of the tax cut bill, we have had 3 million private sector jobs created. What would you say the estimate of the of these jobs? Would you say that perhaps 2/3 or better have received employer-based health care?
That would be my assumption. 5 million new jobs have been created since this administration took office. Many of these, given the fact that we have employer-provided health care in this country, would receive incredible health care as a result. And I would certainly think that that's an intuitive assumption from that.
So, just doing some easy math on that, that would add up, taking people not just off of the unemployment rolls, but also providing them health care. I mean, that could add up to $50, $60 billion right there.
Perhaps.
Okay. So I have one last question. In your modeling for our economic growth, has and I suppose the answer to this is no, because I don't think you're engaged in too much dynamic using current law, but has the plans for opening up trade worldwide, the president's goal of reciprocal trade, lowering tariffs with the goal of getting to 0% tariffs, has that worked into your economic formula at all?
They are. It's one of the reasons that I categorize our economic policies as a whole when I talk about the revenues that are generated. So we include the tax cut impact, we include better trade agreements, we actually include infrastructure spending, which we do think has an impact on economic growth, to one of the questions that I received. We'll have to wait till the Council of Economic Advisors report coming up in the next few weeks as to be able to provide more details on the breakdown amongst all of those different categories, but it's an ongoing story that we intend to tell.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Vogt, for being here. I have a couple things that I want to try to cover, but I want to follow up on a statement that you made not that long ago regarding a program that I'm quite familiar with, having spent 25 years in local government, and that's the Community Development Block Grant Program. And I want to make sure I got this right. I think I heard you say that it's your analysis, or the analysis of the administration, that the Community Development block grant program has demonstrated no economic value. Is that accurate? Is that an accurate statement of your views?
It's that we think that the program has been effective from the standpoint of federal taxpayers. We understand that it will certainly offset costs that state and localities would.
But is that the reason? Is that the reason that Democrats and Republicans have come together to fund CDBG just to offset local government costs, or is there something greater than that? In other words, has it been traditionally a legitimate public investment that has a return to the federal government?
We would disagree as to whether the return to the federal government has been worth the cost, but I'm
So do you think that the federal government benefits, for example, when there's a reduction in crime in a community? Is that a public value that the government has a stake in?
Certainly, but we wouldn't say that the CDBG program is the only
So
way.
on what basis have you come to the conclusion that the CDBG program does not contribute to a reduction in crime? I mean, do you have, for example, any published peer-reviewed studies that demonstrate that the CDBG program does not deliver economic value to the federal government?
We don't.
And even specifically on the issue of reduction in crime or any other subject, any other category.
We believe it's important to reduce crime. We believe that's something that we adequately fund at the Department of Justice resources.
So you think crime is adequately funded, fighting crime in this country is adequately funded. We don't need to do anything else to help communities create infrastructure that reduces crime. Let me just give you an example, because this is a very sore subject for me. Having spent a lot of time working in communities across the country and in my own hometown to deal with blight and abandoned property and seeing the impact they have. I have here a published peer-reviewed study from the Journal of Criminal Justice that points out that the eligible activities in CDBG, which include demolition of vacant and abandoned properties, has a positive impact on violent crime. And it's just one of many studies that I would cite. In fact, Mr. Chairman, if I could ask unanimous consent to have this study included in the record of the committee, I would certainly appreciate that.
Without objection.
I guess the question I have, just to move from this, because obviously I think you and I disagree, and of course many of my Democratic and Republican colleagues who seem quite willing to show up at ribbon-cutting ceremonies that include CDBG dollars obviously also disagree with you on this subject. But I understand your point that you assert that cutting taxes contributes to economic growth and has a positive overall impact ultimately on tax revenues. I disagree with the analysis, but I understand that's your point of view. Do you ever believe that there is a circumstance where increased spending has the effect of reducing a deficit?
I can't think of a scenario.
So you don't believe that, for example, if the National Institutes of Health were able to somehow, through the work of this Congress, double the amount of research into diabetes, and if the amount of research going into diabetes led to, in 5 years, a cure for diabetes, do you think that would have a positive impact on deficits, on spending, on the overall impact that dreaded disease has on our economy?
It would certainly have positive impact.
So cutting the National Institutes of Health, by definition then, could reduce the possibility of that positive impact. Is that correct?
We don't think so, and not by definition is there an assumption that when you take money from federal taxpayers and you contribute it to worthy investments, which we believe that $33 billion is a worthy investment for the National Institute of Health.
But not worthy enough to maintain it at its current level. Not worthy enough to take the bet, for example, that those people out there who happen to be United States taxpayers, who are suffering with diseases like diabetes, multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's, shouldn't at least be able to be given a chance by supporting important research that would not only potentially ease their suffering, which for me is ample justification, and I think actually for most Americans would be ample justification, but using your values, which I don't think we necessarily share, it potentially and probably almost certainly will lead to significant reductions in the cost of health care in this country. Easing suffering does not necessarily mean we can also do something positive, have a positive economic impact. So whether it is research into dreaded diseases, cleaning up abandoned houses in beat-up old neighborhoods, or, for example, the reduction that you propose in drinking water, clean drinking water, what I would simply suggest is consider internalizing the positive and negative externalities in these decisions, and I think what you'll find is that a different set of priorities would take us a lot further. I yield back.
Can I briefly respond?
You may respond.
I think it's a fair point, sir, and I don't want to suggest that some of the research advances that we make at National Institute of Health wouldn't have a long-term impact on the cost of paying for coverage for those diseases for the people that benefit from healthcare programs. We haven't done the sorts of economic analysis to tell you what those would be, but I do think it matters as to where the investments that we're making and not making just a blanket statement that just because dollar of federal spending that it's going to result in some kind of dynamic growth. I think that's what I would reject on the back end, but I take your point.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Burchett, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. Mr. Vogt, thank you so much for being here. I grew up in a pretty cool home. I can remember Daddy had a little thing on his mirror, and it said, "You deny me before men, and I'll deny you for the gates of heaven." And I wanted to thank you for your service to our country right now. And in preparing for this, I noticed that when you testified before the Senate, I thought you were unfairly attacked for your faith. And I thought it was outrageous at the time. And it seems to me it's an appropriate moment to just say thank you for being in the public square as a person of faith. And it troubles me that a U.S. Senator would ignore the First Amendment and to question the motives of any public official based on religion. And I wondered if you would want to comment on that or what preluded that. If not, we're good.
Sir, I don't have any comment. I'm here to be representing the administration on the budget policies that the President's budget puts forward.
Thank you. All right. Well, let me start off by stating I'm in full agreement of the President's goal of fiscal responsibility, specifically with education. I'm complimenting him on this. I believe the states should have the full authority over education. I've stated the Department of Education I think we'd be better off if they dissolved it and sent the money to the states directly. I think the people at the state and the local level, the school board level, know exactly what's going on in the classroom. Some bureaucrat up here doesn't, I don't think, have a clue other than to preserve their jobs and the jobs of others. Where do you see the education budget moving forward? And could we see any savings in that by giving the money back to the states? And do you see any movement in that direction?
We hope so. It's one of the reasons we put forward the policies in this budget. As I said, we have a $50 billion investment of allowing people to keep more of their own money to be able to invest in state scholarship programs, either public or private school choice. So we think that that's a better way to invest in students and communities and our education system. We also want to make sure that we continue to be able to focus precious federal dollars that we are stewards of from a taxpayer perspective on programs work. So we continue to fund programs that we do think that work, many of the formula programs within the Department of Education, but we also look to eliminate programs that don't work. One program, the 21st Century's Community Education Program, these are centers that don't work. They don't have an increase in proficiency in reading and math. Students stay in these centers very short amount of time. And so it's one of those things from an effective standpoint we've looked at and said, this is just a dollar that's not well spent. And in some cases in this budget, when we have a program that's not working, we try to reform it like we do with Job Corps. In this instance, we didn't think that we could reform it. We'd rather focus the dollars elsewhere.
And you could pass this on to the President. I have a degree in education. I was actually certified to teach, and my mama taught forever. And my daddy was a longtime dean, and my sister still is an educator. And I've never, ever seen a federal bureaucrat in our classrooms, ever. And yet they seem to just always want to pass it down to our locals, and that drives me crazy. I also wanted to compliment the President on his proposal regarding HIV. A lady in my district, very close to me, she's not in my political party, but she her name's Julia Tucker, and she lost her son to HIV. And she helped start an organization called Positively Living, which I'm proud to support. My wife's going to be sitting at her table at an event, I believe, Thursday. Could you provide some more details on how the goal is going to be achieved regarding HIV? I know the president said basically just wanted to eliminate it, and of course it's changed so much. I have friends that I grew up with. I'm pretty sure some of them died of HIV. And they were just more or less ostracized, but now it seems we've got medication, we've got things, but it's so dadgum expensive. Is there some way you could address that, please?
Sure, thank you for the question. It's one of those initiatives in this budget that we're very proud of. As we went through the budget process, we worked with the Department of Health and Human Service, and they put forward a proposal. They said, look, we can make serious gains in here based on the drugs that are out there, but we need people to be tested. And one of the $300 million investment in this budget, it is allocated within HHS. There's money for HRSA, there's money for the Ryan White healthcare programs, there's some money for Indian Health Services, and we're really predominantly trying to increase the testing to be able to make sure that people can get the life-saving medications that have now been developed and can fundamentally change and prolong their life, which is fantastic.
Gentleman's time has expired. And now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Vogt, thank you for your testimony today. A couple of quick observations and then a couple of questions, if I might. The tax cut bill, which has been referred to, I think is generally perceived to be a tax cut for wealthiest Americans, and consensus by economists that the stimulus was largely unnecessary during the, as it relates to tax policy, during an economic expansion which was well underway for 6 years prior to this administration. In fact, if you look at all charts from 2010, unemployment, wages, unemployment rates have continued on an upward path since 2010. Tax cut did not pay for itself. I think that's been pretty well established, and it does not have appeared to have added to the long-term economic expansion, although there may have been some short-term stimulus. And the tax bill also capped state and local tax deductibility, which has long been a part of our income tax structure since it was created in the 19th century. Would the President and the administration support elimination of the cap on the SALT deduction?
As the President has stated, sir, he's been willing to consider it, but it's something that he feels that Congress should take a look at, and if they want to send him a bill, he's willing to consider it, but it's a debate that he thinks should start with Congress, and we have not assumed any changes in our revenue policies.
I want to go back to something that I think was raised by the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, earlier. He talked about, and I just want to make sure I get this, that related to not only the CBO's budget projections, or economic projections rather, but the Federal Reserve and most private economists do not agree with the administration's assessment on the rate of growth. In fact, I know a number have indicated they think 3% is unlikely to be maintained in the long run, that we barely got to 3% in 2018, may have been impacted somewhat by temporary stimulus, and they forecast, I think CBO forecasts, annual average growth rate of less than 2%. You indicated in your testimony that you had not even considered or projected a lower than expected growth rate. But given the fact that there is a substantial body of economists, both in the public sector and private sector, who don't agree, I can't imagine you haven't looked at projections that aren't at 3%. Is that what your testimony was, that you haven't even considered that?
We know it will have an impact on it, and we've had some rough modeling, but it's not the type of precision that we would be able to put forward like we do with the economic report of the President. I would mention with regard to the private forecasters, they were wrong the first 2 years. They said it was outrageous and ludicrous, and we were proven right in both years. We're the most accurate administration in history as far as the data has been collected.
I do note that even in the budget, as I understand it, 2025, which is when there is a substantial, likely to be, I think CBO estimates that it will boosted modestly economic growth but ultimately serves as a drag on growth rates beginning in 2025. And I wondered if you're modeling, it obviously is different from CBO. How do you adjust for that? What is your explanation of what is different in the two models? And I do note also, even in the president's budget, that in 2025, it does show a substantial dip in the growth of receipts starting in 2025.
Specifically, the difference between us and CBO as it pertains to the out-year growth rates has to do with capital formulation and the fact that CBO does not, we believe, track with the economic literature that suggests that there will be significant increases in capital investment. We're already seeing that year to year with the figure that I gave earlier with the increase in non-residential fixed investment of increasing 7%. So this is an example where, as a result of capital investment, companies are expanding their businesses, making investments, and we believe that that is the fundamental reason for why this tax cut's not just juicing the economy and move on with our lives, but is actually producing long-term, fundamental, structural, higher revenues and economic growth for the country to benefit from.
Well, I do note that it's not only the Congressional Budget Office, but private economists and the Federal Reserve don't necessarily concur with that assumption. Let me quickly move on, and I recognize I'm almost out of time, so I'd like to come back to you perhaps offline to talk about some of the Medicare challenges. But your estimate is a $500 billion reduction in the rate of growth over the next 10 years as a result of your policies?
Yes, we have $517 billion in savings in Medicare. These are program integrity, drug pricing reductions, and a number of scenarios where we think that just common sense would dictate that we pay particular sites of care the same, whether they are a skilled nursing facility or a long-term care hospital.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Vogt, thank you for taking the time to come in here and address the committee. Appreciate your service to this country, and I'd echo the comments of Mr. Burkett about your willingness to stand up with respect to the attacks that were levied against your faith unfairly in the United States Senate. So thank you for being here. A couple questions. Would you agree that when you balance your budget at home, or that most American people balance their budget, they look at revenues on the one side, that is the income they receive, and they balance that against what they need to spend on the other side, and they're trying to spend within the amount that they bring in revenues?
Yes.
And is that the goal, should that be the goal of the United States? That we look at our revenues, and then we look at what we've got, and then we spend within our means?
It absolutely should be.
Is that the goal of this budget presented by the president, to set us on a path towards spending within the means?
It is absolutely, and I appreciate the question, Congressman, because it would be easy when you don't balance within 10 years, which is the normal budget window that budgets provide for, to say balance isn't important. We don't believe that. We believe that balance is important, that it's the debate that every family has across this country about what they can spend versus what they bring in. And we want the federal government to operate more like an American family from that standpoint, which is one of the reasons we said, all right, what can we do outside the normal window? We can get there within 15, and we did so.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate you presenting a budget that actually balances, albeit in 15 years. You know as well as I do, I'd rather see that in 10 or 5, but I appreciate you at least submitting one that balances. Question, in order to do that on the revenue side, right, we need to get revenues up or keep them up. And is that what you're assuming based on the economic growth under this president's policies, that we're getting revenues up?
Absolutely, yes.
And in doing so, I've heard a lot of concerns about the cost of the tax cuts, the so-called cost of the tax cut. Would you agree that CBO last year said that that cut initially would cost $1.69 trillion, but amended that based on, CBO, by the way, not y'all, amended that based on increases in revenue, amended that down that we would save $1.1 trillion out of that because of economic growth, because we would have $6.1 trillion bigger economy by 2027. We'd save $150 billion on the entitlement side of the ledger, and that would leave us with a $440 billion net cost because of tax increases. Does that sound right with what CBO said?
I do believe it sounds right with what CBO said. The basic point, I think, is that CBO, there's been a debate the last 3 years, is does tax cuts lead to economic growth? Does it increase revenues? And we believe that CBO is coming our way in saying that since the president took office, there's been $1.3 trillion in additional receipts generated from economic growth.
Right.
Now, they're not making the same claims that we are with regard to our economic policies covering the cost of the tax cut. I'm not here to say that they are, but we do think that they are providing data points that argue in favor of what we've been arguing for 2 years.
And on the other side of the coin, when we talk about spending, is it about 30%-ish discretionary and 70% not mandatory?
Correct.
And within mandatory, can you please tell me what you feel about the great big press conference that was held on the front of the Capitol on a bipartisan basis with massive proposals to deal with mandatory spending and entitlements? Do you agree with all the points made by members on both sides of the aisle when they stood up and talked about all the reforms to Medicare and Social Security that we saw on the steps of the Capitol recently?
I don't recall specifically which press conference you're referring to, but I know that mandatory spending is a significant issue, and often Congress has put forward increases to mandatory spending. We are seeing that with proposals that are being offered for Medicare for All, which would be in the neighborhood of $32 trillion.
And so you don't recall that because it didn't happen, right? Are you aware of any serious proposal in Congress to massively reform entitlement spending?
I am not aware of that.
On either side of the aisle?
I think that the one side of the aisle has attempted to look at mandatory spending over the last several years, but again, spending is a bipartisan problem. I'm not here to say otherwise.
And is there any serious political capital being spent to promote such a plan? No.
Not that we have seen so far.
So now, on the discretionary side of the ledger, half defense, half non-defense discretionary. On the non-defense discretionary, does this chart roughly reflect what we've seen with respect to caps and busting caps over the last 6 or 7 years?
Yes.
The chart that my colleague from Virginia, Mr. Scott, put forward talking about deficit spending year by year under different presidents, you rightly noted that in 1994 we had a Republican Congress that came in to work with a president who, by the way, at least admitted that the era of big government was over and tried to work with us. Then we noted that deficit spending under President Obama increased massively. What happened in 2011 that caused those deficits to reduce?
What happened in 2011? I don't know off the top of my head.
With the budget, what was the BCA?
Yeah, the BCA agreements, there's certainly the two, we put forward a series of spending caps that were designed to limit and pay for the debt limit increase at the time. Unfortunately, Congress has walked those spending caps back every 2 years and increased our spending as a result.
Thank you, Mr. Vogt.
Yep. The gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
I thank the chairman very much and the ranking member. I thank the director for his presence here. We're all committed to the American people. But as I look up and raise up this budget that says for a better America, you know that I have a completely contrary view of this. In fact, I think this hurts the most vulnerable in America and people who have worked in America, seniors who have worked in America. And so I want to pose questions along those lines. First of all, I think it is important to note that the top 10% of America's population now average more than 9 times as much income as the bottom 90%. 9 times. Americans in the top 1% average over 40 times more income than the bottom 90%. The nation's top 0.1% are taking in over 198 times the income of the bottom 90%. That's a lot of people. And African-American families with just over $3,500 owns just 2% of the wealth. I don't believe that this budget that is interested in cutting from the very heart of the needs of people, from education to health care to the environment, $2.7 trillion, is seriously committed to working in a bipartisan manner to provide for the great America so that all people have the ability. My questions to you involve issues around Medicare, $850+ billion. How does that in any way make America better when you attack the most vulnerable?
As I mentioned earlier, thank you for your statement. I do believe that budgets are about our visions for the country. It is inaccurate to say that our budget cuts Medicare by $845 billion. We increase Medicare every single year. The savings that we include and assume in this budget is $517 billion. The The $845 billion number that has been reported in the press comes from the fact that there's not an assumption that we are other places outside of Medicare providing for uncompensated care and graduate medical education at our hospitals.
Might I say, if I might, reclaiming my time, if I might, those kinds of shenanigans and manipulation may sound good, but it is accurate that there are cuts coming out of Medicare of $845 billion, almost $850 billion. Also, I want to take note of the fact that here's a president who engages with Russia, North Korea, wants to pull troops out of Syria and Afghanistan. So why in the world are you asking for $750 billion for defense, in contrast to the enormity of the amount of billions of dollars that you're cutting from education, environment, Medicaid, Medicare? What is the purpose of using non-defense discretionary, this statement of mandatory, which makes it sound negative, of course, from the very beginning? Why is that always the target when vulnerable people, from seniors to young people to minorities who've not had equal opportunities in many instances, as you've indicated, the income of African Americans, to the contrary of this administration's representation, it has not been good for them. Why are you going after the vulnerable in this budget?
We don't think we are going after the budget, the vulnerable in this budget, Congresswoman. We think that we are trying to find reforms that make sense, that would improve the lives of the beneficiaries. I think one of the 2 points that I think are reflected in your comments that I do want to get to. I think it's fair to say, why are we always looking on the mandatory side? One of the reasons I've been trying to have a conversation with the members on this side of the aisle is that we think that non-defense discretionary spending is an area where we need to do our best to continue to look for efficiencies and get rid of wasteful programs.
Well, reclaim my time, if I might, and I appreciate the interest of engagement. Let me make it very clear as I end. This budget attacks the most vulnerable in this nation. It is unequal in wealth. The tax scam is still the most powerful undermining of growth and prosperity in this nation by pushing money toward the top 0.1% or the top 1% and leaving those who can add to the economy along the highway of despair. This budget will not go. I yield back.
The lady yields back. Any further comments from the witness?
No, sir.
Okay, thank you. Now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Vogt, thank you for being here in your testimony, and I'd like to thank you for your hard work and tough choices that went into the formulation of this budget. One of the benefits of always going last is that I really get to observe the philosophical differences between Democrats and Republicans. And here's a couple of my observations. There's a key difference in how we view spending and where it should occur. There's a key difference in where we view where government services should occur. On the Democrat side, I believe they're overlooking the fact that we have local and state governments. Every single problem, and some of these are real problems, some of these are real investments, but there's this belief that it always has to be solved at the federal level, always. And I believe your budget takes note of that. I believe your budget takes note of the fact that maybe, just maybe, some of these things, and some of them have been mentioned today, maybe it's law enforcement, maybe it's crime, maybe it's housing, maybe it's clean water, education, maybe some of these things can be solved by state and local actors, where constituents can go down the street and knock on the door of their representation and say, yeah, you can raise my taxes, but I want it going towards this, as opposed to the federal government, which they really have no idea where their taxes are going oftentimes. It's also really interesting to note this idea that more must always be better, that the bigger the dollar sign is, the bigger your heart is. You know, and there's this notion that if we want to cut back on programs, and in many cases, if you notice, and as you noted, and we'll get to this, what a cut really means, but just because you might want to cut down on something that isn't benefiting the American people, that you're now anti-science or anti-healthcare, that is a moral accusation. That's an accusation against our intentions, and that's not right. We have different views of how we should spend this money. It really is as simple as that. I want to give you an opportunity again to explain to us, because there's been a lot of confusion over this, what a cut is versus what slowing growth is. So it's been noted over and over again that maybe we should reform the pattern of growth on Medicaid and Medicare. Are we actually cutting these programs? Because you've said it over and over again, but I want to clarify, these programs seem to be increasing their budget every single year, pretty drastically, actually.
They are, Congressman, and we would have this, I think, a similar definition of a cut, which is that a dollar amount increasing, a dollar amount less than the previous year, not a dollar amount less than a projection from someone from the year before.
Well, I would just hope that we could have honest conversations about this, because your regular listener who's watching the news and watching the lies being told on media that we're cutting programs, what they're thinking is, hey, we spent $100 on it this year, and next year we're spending $90 on it. But that's not true, is it?
No.
That's unfortunate. I wish we could have an honest conversation, and I wish people would understand, why we might want to reform some of these programs. Social Security, disability insurance. Why would I want to reform that? Maybe because I was eligible for it. I was eligible to get thousands of dollars of taxpayer money as soon as I retired from the military. The federal government told me I should get on that. The military told me I should get on that program. I am not disabled. I have a thing going on here, kind of a disability, but I am not disabled. I should not get that money. But that program says I should. There's something wrong there. I'm perfectly capable of working. I want to get to another couple details in my time left here. This budget talks about increasing what people can contribute to their health savings accounts. Does that include direct primary care?
Let me get back to you on that particular question, but we are excited about the reforms that we have in health savings accounts, both in Medicare and outside. One of the situations that we see is that the rules of the HSA programs are too restrictive. And so if you have an insurance product that attempts to provide absorb the cost for generics or take care of other preventive medicine to lower their cost and the cost of the beneficiary over time, that if they offer those kinds of insurance products, that then the individual is no longer eligible for an HSA. So what we're trying to do is to say, what's an actuarial way in which we can make that assessment and expand those programs?
That's good. I don't have enough time to get you to answer this question, but I want to commend you all for putting paid family leave in there. I think Republicans need to come up with a conservative, sustainable solution to that. In my last 10 seconds, I want to ask you about the cuts to the Army Corps of Engineers budget and why that may be the case. What is the justification for this? There's a backlog of about $100 billion for infrastructure investment. A place like Houston, we cared a great deal about that, and it's a worthy investment for the future. So I'll let you take that. Thank you.
Witness may respond.
I would like to respond. One of the things that we've been most frustrated with Army Corps is how slow they are with many of the projects. We're trying with this budget to say, continue to focus on the backlog and things that are already underway and making a line in the sand to say not to go forward with new starts, particularly when there's so much disaster money that's in the system that needs to get spent as well. So I certainly get it. We do support Army Corps of Engineers spending, and we think that this is a sustainable level, but we also understand where you're coming from.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Vogt, for being here. In December of last year, somebody made a statement that said this: the U.S. spent $716 billion this year. Crazy. Do you agree with that statement?
No, I don't agree with that statement.
You don't agree with that statement. And then in October, there was another statement that was made that said we need to, quote, get rid of the fat, get rid of the waste. And a suggestion was made for a defense budget of $700 billion, which would have been a 2% cut over the previous fiscal year. Do you agree with that proposal?
I remember the conversation we had in terms of developing the defense budget for this budget, where we...
Do you agree with that statement that the defense budget should be cut by 2% and that we should get rid of the fat and get rid of the waste? Yes or no?
I certainly agree that we need to eliminate the fat and the waste. I don't agree
so you
that
agree
we
with
should
that?
have a reduction of 2%.
Okay, so you have just disagreed with the President of the United States. Both of those statements were made by Donald Trump In December, Donald Trump tweeted, the U.S. spent $716 billion this year, crazy. And then in October, Defense News reported that Trump told the cabinet to, quote, get rid of the fat, get rid of the waste, and suggested a defense budget of $700 billion, which would have been a 2% cut over the previous fiscal year. Strange support, bipartisan support between what President Trump said and what some of us have been saying for some time. So, Acting Director Vogt, how much did the president cut total national defense spending by in his 2020 budget, the budget you have before us today?
We are increasing the budget by 5%. And can I respond to the comments the president made?
No, let me just go through, and if I have time at the end, I would like to have the chairman give you the opportunity. So you actually are proposing an increase of 5% to DOD spending, not a decrease of 2%, which is what the president said he wanted in October. And did non-defense spending also go up by 4.7 or 5% in your budget?
No, it did not. Non-defense spending went down by 5%.
I have that it was cut by 9%, but is it 5%?
It is 5% from the fiscal year 19 discretionary cap level.
So overall, the cut is what?
Overall, it's a larger cut. It's
Which
5%
is what?
from the cap level.
What is the overall cut to non-defense discretionary spending?
Well, if you include all of the gimmicks that Congress uses to hide the cost that the agencies spend at, that is much higher than...
Do you know what it is? What is the number?
Year. We have roughly about an average 10%.
Double cut of the increase is 5% for defense, and the cut is 10% of non-defense discretionary, which, by the way, is education, healthcare, a number of other critical priorities. Now, let me ask you about OCO, which we call the slush fund. Mick Mulvaney, your boss, who's now serving as the president's chief of staff, referred to the Overseas Contingency Operation funding as a slush fund. He agreed with us then, back when he was in Congress. And the House Armed Services Chairman Smith has also called OCO a slush fund. And so let me ask you, in this budget, how much does the president propose cutting the Defense Department's slush fund in fiscal year 20?
We propose increasing the...
How much are you proposing to increase it by?
Increase it up to from $69 billion to $164 billion. So
you're proposing to increase a slush fund that has been called that by the president's chief of staff and by our chairman of the Armed Services Committee by 138% to $165 billion over 2019. Now, I want to ask you, you made a statement earlier in this hearing. You said the National Science Foundation doesn't need to be immune from waste, fraud, and abuse, correct?
I said that the National Science Foundation is not immune from waste, fraud.
Is not, okay. Doesn't need to be, is not immune. So let me ask you, do you think that the Defense Department should be immune from waste, fraud, and abuse?
I don't know.
Okay. And do you know when Congress mandated that all government agencies, including the Pentagon, should undergo an audit? Do you know when that happened, what year?
A long time ago.
It was 1990. It was 1990, almost 3 decades ago. And tell me, Mr. Vogt, when was the first audit, comprehensive audit of the Pentagon done?
This year, under this administration.
This year. So almost 30 years later, we do an audit of an agency that has a $716 billion budget right now. You're proposing a significant increase. And how many of the 21 individual audits that were part of this comprehensive audit of the Pentagon, how many of those failed? So where did the Pentagon just fail all these audits? Do you know, out of the 21?
Off the top of my head, no, but I'm sure you do.
14 out of 21. So 2/3 of all of these audits failed, and in fact, 2 just received a passing grade. And auditors estimated that the Pentagon made improper payments, that's their term, which is not necessarily fraud, but it is payments that lacked sufficient or appropriate documentation or approvals, which means we have no idea where that money went, of $957 million in 2017 and $1.2 billion in 2018. So let me ask you, Mr. Vogt, do you think that we should continue to increase the Defense Department's budget when we have no idea where that money is actually going and the Pentagon can't even pass an audit and in fact didn't even do an audit for almost 30 years?
Congresswoman, we think that one of the promises kept of this budget is that we're the first administration to actually comply with the statutes of Congress to actually do the audit. And that
Well, that's good, and hopefully you take that on before you ask for more money. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Acting Director Vogt, thank you for being here. I believe that Trump's economic policies are clearly working. You testified of a lot of the statistics, the over 5 million plus new jobs. It's clearly the work of President Trump and the Republican Congress in passing the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, reducing unnecessary regulations, creating an energy policy that is now going to be #1 in the world. Various aspects. It's truly the policies of serving the American people and not the government itself. In the president's budget, he makes some difficult spending decisions. While I don't agree with all of them, I commend the president for making these tough calls. The budget cuts $2 trillion in mandatory spending, reins in the cost of health care by giving control back to states and patients, reforms welfare programs while maintaining the safety net, and maintains the historic reforms from the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. In particular, I'm glad that President Trump shares my views on the importance of making the 20% pass-through rate for small businesses permanent. This is an important reform from the tax cut bill that expires in 2025 if we don't act. Thanks to this provision and others from the tax bill, today our economy continues to create jobs and grow at a record rate. And recent polling shows that small business owner optimism is at an all-time high. Mr. Vogt, how do you think small businesses would be impacted if the 20% pass-through rate were allowed to expire?
We think they would be impacted very negatively, and that one of the reasons that we want to extend the tax cuts in this budget is we want to provide certainty to the businesses that are making investment. I'm not sure as a small business owner how you can make long-term investments when you are facing an expiration in some of these tax provisions. So again, when we talk about promises kept, we are talking about keeping our promise to American taxpayers, in the case of your question, small business owners, to be able to say this was not just a one-time tax cut, but we're actually extending these provisions into permanent law.
I also was very glad to hear in the President's State of the Union address about the attempt to increase investment in fighting pediatric cancer research. Could you explain a little bit about that in the President's budget?
Sure, it's in a line item that is not just a line item. It's a spending initiative that's very important to the President. We are taking spending for pediatric cancer from about $548 million to $598 million, an increase of $50 million every single year because we think it's so important.
I totally agree, and I appreciate seeing that. I'm pretty excited that, this is how the process has started. The President has brought forth his budget to Congress, and it's a beginning point. I just hope, and I reiterate to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, after 8 years of voting against Republican budgets, I hope that the leadership on the other side will find time to present a bill to the floor of the House of Representatives for the entire Congress can vote on a budget. The President has done the heavy lifting. You have done the heavy lifting by presenting a budget. They've done a good job at attacking. Now let's see the Democrat alternative. Let's have a vote on the House floor of the Democrat alternative, and let's do the people's business and put people before politics. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Panetta, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this opportunity. Mr. Vogt, thank you for being here. Thank you for your time, your preparation, as well as coming yesterday to our pre-meeting. I appreciate that. I'm going to talk about the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Normally, the gentlewoman from Connecticut would be asking you a lot of questions about this, but fortunately for me, she's not here, so I get to answer these questions. She may come a little bit later, and I'll be throwing you some softballs compared to her hardballs, I can tell you that much. You're well aware what the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program is, SNAP. I'm sure you're well aware of the 42 million people in this nation that rely on it, as well as 18 million children and 74,000 people in my district on the Central Coast of California who rely on the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, otherwise known as food stamps. Now, in this budget, you find savings of over $220 billion over 10 years from that program specifically, correct?
We do have savings of that magnitude.
Okay. And 3 months ago, you're aware that the Farm Bill was passed, obviously, right? Mm-hmm. And in that process of getting to a Farm Bill, and I would call it a bipartisan Farm Bill, Democrats and Republicans voted on it, in which they rejected the mandatory work requirements that are being imposed in this proposal, this budget right now, correct?
You're right that there was not a work requirement in the Farm Bill that the President signed.
Even though it was proposed initially on that Farm Bill, but then rejected in order to pass the Farm Bill, correct?
Correct.
Thank you. And one of the reasons I can tell you is being on the Ag Committee at that time, one of the reasons why that proposal failed was because there was absolutely no evidence that those proposals would work. It was based on ideology, not policy. It was based on emotion, not evidence. And as a former prosecutor, I knew early on that I couldn't just stand up in court and say someone's guilty and sit back down. I had to prove my case. That proposal couldn't be proved, therefore it was rejected by Democrats and Republicans. That's how we were able to get to a Farm Bill. What evidence do you have that this proposal will work?
Well, we just would look at the history of the 1990s and what we've seen since then, which is that when work requirements were put in TANF, that it reduced caseloads, many people went back to work, and people who were exiting welfare were able to achieve much higher levels of income with the incentive to go back to work.
Okay, but you wouldn't look at the evidence. You don't have any pilot programs or anything of that nature that it would actually work right now, correct?
Again, we would look at the
okay,
basic
reclaiming my time. Reclaiming my time, thank you. And part of the proposal, part of these savings that you talk about, is a proposal to spend $5.8 billion to serve food stamp participants with a Blue Apron-style food box delivery service in lieu of cash benefits for low-income families, correct?
Not in lieu of all cash benefits. We will continue to provide cash benefits in addition to providing the harvest box, which you mentioned.
Okay, great. And this harvest box, it was already, well, I wouldn't say proposed, it was floated out there during the buildup of the 2018 Farm Bill, and it was widely rejected by food assistance experts, correct?
Not all good ideas, time has come, and we continue to put forward a reform that we think is one that we're excited about. It was proposed last year's budget. It was not enacted in the Farm Bill, and we continue to see the value in it. Because
there were such issues like distribution. Do you know whether or not this food box would be distributed door to door?
Those are the kinds of questions that we think that the policy process and working with Congress would answer. But we've had a lot of feedback from working with the private sector that would be interested in engaging with us on this, and so we think it has a lot of merit.
And what would happen when people aren't home, Mr. Vogt? What would happen in the time of natural disasters? Would it be distributed through a distribution center? Do you know any of these details?
We're not prepared to offer a lot of details in the proposal, but other than that, to say that we think
that's fine. Reclaiming my time. Thank you. Do you know what would be in this food box? Yes or no, please.
We've been working with the United States Department of Agriculture to ensure that a balanced diet of all the staples.
Let me tell you what was in the last food box that was proposed. Juice, cereals, pasta, peanut butter, canned fruits and vegetables, shelf-stable milk, oh, and I forgot, canned meat. Now, I haven't ate today, at all today, and it's lunchtime, but I'm not hungry right now after reading that. Are you hungry?
Again, this was not meant to replace the benefits that are currently receiving. There will still be cash benefits, and I would just say, these are the types of details that we would actually hope that we can work with you on. It's not a static proposal. We think that the basic concept is something that works in the private sector for people who are not on food stamps. Let me just give you an example from the standpoint of a daughter who relies on medicine that comes at a certain time. If we're not home, the impact on us is that it goes back to FedEx, and we are out of pocket substantial amount of dollars because we weren't home. So we're fully confident that individuals are responsible enough, whether they are on food stamps or not, to be able to work with their federal government or whoever the contractor is to be able to deliver and have them at home to be able to receive the food that's necessary. And we're willing to work with you to make sure that what people actually would receive is something that they would be excited about. It certainly is something with regard to the private sector options that are out there.
Mr. Vogt, thank you very much. Appreciate it and look forward to working with you. Yield back my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. I'm going to have to leave the hearing and turn over the chair in about 5 minutes, so I'm just going to take my time right now. Just one point and a couple of brief questions. One is I want to remind my colleagues on the other side that when CBO scored the Affordable Care Act just before its enactment, they estimated the legislation would reduce federal deficits by $124 billion over the 2010 to 2019 period, and by roughly 0.5% of GDP over the ensuing decade. Moreover, CBO's March 2010 baseline before enactment of the ACA projected Medicare spending for 2019 to be $828 billion. CBO's latest baseline projects Medicare spending for 2019 to be $632 billion. So projected Medicare spending is almost 1/4 less than it was before the ACA, in part due to the significant cost containment measures and delivery system reforms in the law. And I might mention that I remember well during 2009 and 2010 when we proposed $750 billion in cost savings to Medicare, and my colleagues on the other side, many of whom who are now on the committee, were not there then, but battered Democrats for the same argument that you're now making versus with regard to your reductions in Medicare. But my one question is, your budget contemplates the full repeal of the Affordable Care Act. Is that correct?
I wouldn't say it's the full repeal at all.
You repealed Medicaid expansion in the budget.
We have a repeal and replace of Medicaid with state health care block grants. And
right,
so
and
we say that the fair way to comparison is to add the state, the Medicaid program dollars going forward and those state health care block grants to figure out what is the amount of money that states would have to meet the needs under the statutes to provide health care coverage.
The current structure of Medicaid expansion would be replaced. So yes. In Kentucky, where nearly 500,000 of 4.4 million residents now receive their health care through the Medicaid expansion, would be in serious jeopardy of losing their care.
We don't believe so, sir. Let me just walk you through the numbers on Medicaid. We have $1.48 trillion in savings in Medicaid, but we replace that with $1.2 trillion in spending for these state block grants, in which we assume a lot of the policies of the Graham-Cassidy legislation that would continue to ensure that populations are covered with health care. Right now, under the ACA, the federal share of Medicaid reimbursement is 90% under the law. It would not be under your replacement plan, is that correct? That's correct. So there would be, assuming that a state even continued to insure the same amount of people, the federal contribution would be significantly lower. Is that correct? And we think that's an important part of the reform, that with the ACA, we've moved away from paying 57% on average for the most important and needy populations. And now we're paying for 90% of the costs of populations that Medicaid was never intended to cover. We think that as a result, from a program perspective, that Medicaid has lost focus on the disabled, that Medicaid has lost focus when it comes to women and children, as opposed to able-bodied adults that Medicaid expansion now covers. We think that there's a fundamental incentive problem within the current Medicaid program. You would get a significant argument from the 80,000 people in my district who now have Medicaid coverage because of the expansion, and the other 420,000 in Kentucky. So I will yield back my time and recognize Ms. Omar of Minnesota for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Vaughn, for your testimony today. I wanted to talk a little bit about how your budget proposal is going to have impact on the millions of vulnerable children across this country. I wanted to tell you a little bit about the impact that I see that it will have, because I don't feel like you or this administration or Trump gets it. In America, 1 out of 5 children struggle with hunger. And for many of these children, the free lunch and breakfast that they get in school is often the only meal they get to have. Yet the budget that you're proposing, and this administration and Trump is proposing, makes a $1.7 billion cut from school meals over the next 10 years. A cut that largely would result in more than 29,000 children losing access to free school meals program in my home state of Minnesota alone. What this budget does is quite literally take food out of the mouths of children. How can these kids be expected to be present and fully present in classes, to learn in the same space as other kids? How can we expect them to reach their full potential? And how can we expect them to be able to be on the same footing as other kids around the world? I often say that budgets are a value statement, as you have many times in this committee. And you said that we are committed to having promises kept. What does this budget and your proposal in cutting the child nutrition programs say about the promises that we want to keep to children and where our values really are?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. We don't think that our budget cuts the programs that you refer to. Specifically, we think that it's important that high-income schools that are currently grouped together right now to receive benefits because they're grouped with low-income schools, that's unfair for the programs themselves. Similarly, some of the reductions that you've talked about are with regard to one-time rescissions that are not needed to be able to cover all of the children that we currently project. And we know Congress does the same analysis.
Yeah. How is the assessment made what child deserves to eat and what child doesn't? My understanding is that we should care about every single child arriving in that school, having the resources that they need to be able to get educated and be fully present. We have parents who might fall off the threshold of whatever that income is, who might not be able to pack a lunch or a breakfast or milk or a cookie or an apple for their kids. Should those kids not be able to have meals in the school so that they can be fully present in that classroom? Is that what this administration values?
We believe it's important that communities that are otherwise ineligible to receive these types of benefits not receive these benefits, and that only the communities that are eligible receive them.
But how is the judgment of what the value of the benefits is made? We are talking about children in our classrooms. We are talking about America's most vulnerable. Earlier, you talked about the harvest box. You said if they are not home, that they should pay a price.
No, I didn't say that.
That was the example you used, that if you're not home, then you pay a fee.
No.
So what penalty would you think should we propose for people who might not be home to receive juice or a cereal box or a canned meat?
I specifically was not referring to suggesting that they should pay a penalty. The point I was making, Congresswoman, is that we don't think that it matters where you are on the income scale to be able to determine a certain level of responsibility to receive in the mail that which you are expecting to receive in the mail. We think that human beings are responsible from that standpoint.
I get that. What I am saying is we have a responsibility to make sure that here in the United States, people are fed. We are talking about food. We are talking about children having food.
We agree.
We give humanitarian assistance to people around the world because we believe people should not experience food insecurity. People should not starve. But here in the United States, we decide to increase a defense budget that might lead to not having our budgets be fully intact, but we decide to say that we don't have enough money to feed our most vulnerable.
Thank you.
That is the decision we're making.
Thank you, Ms. Omar. The time has expired. The chair will now recognize Ms. Schakowsky from Illinois.
Thank you. It is incredible to me, and I want to associate myself with the remarks of Congresswoman Omar. 1 out of 5 American children is considered food insecure. That is scandalous, I think. I want to say that this budget is envisions really, I think, a radically different America than I believe most Americans can and want to envision. This budget is built on the politics, I think, of division, the politics of resentment, which on the one hand should not surprise anyone, given the president who kicked off his campaign by attacks on people of color and immigrants. Anyway, on the other hand, though, I think it should surprise a lot, and does surprise a lot of people, since at his June 2015 press conference announcing his candidacy, he said, "Save Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security without cuts. Have to do it," he said. And yet the budget, you don't want to hear $845 billion, so I'll say your number, $517 billion will come out of Medicare. The budget before us cuts Medicaid by $1.5 trillion before really, in my view, cannibalizing it by converting it into a block grant. The budget before us cuts Social Security by $25 billion. Oh yes, those terrible entitlements that are so precious to millions and millions, the majority of American families. So, Mr. Vogt, did President Trump acknowledge he was breaking a key campaign promise when he agreed to a budget that cuts Medicare by, what are we saying now, $517 billion?
The president doesn't believe he's breaking his commitment to the American people at all. There are no structural changes to Medicare. There is no cut to Medicare. Medicare continues to grow each and every year. The president also committed to the American people that he was going to attempt to lower drug prices. And so many of the reforms within Medicare that generate savings simply because the federal government pays for the drugs of seniors is because we are trying to lower, and we have proposals to lower drug costs.
That's so interesting that you would want to predict. You know, usually when we do budgeting, it's really not dynamic, and we talk about that you're predicting that the president is, in fact, going to end up lowering these drug prices. You build that in, and therefore cut Medicare by the projected amount that you think is actually going to be saved. Mr. Vogt, did President Trump acknowledge that he was breaking a key campaign promise when he supported the cuts to Medicaid and then turn it into a block grant?
We do not believe that we are breaking the commitment to Medicaid in the least, that Medicaid spending, in addition to where we transfer our reforms to Medicaid, the state health care block grant, will continue to grow every year.
You think that all the states in the nation, you predict that, are going to continue to make sure that low-income people, most of whom are children, are going to have as much money for Medicaid by transferring all that authority to the states to decide?
We think that the reforms that we put forward with the assumptions to have a state health care block grant can lead to better coverage at the state and local level. Medicaid is not what we would view as the optimal program. I remember when Henry Waxman said that there's not a lot of millionaires on Medicaid and wouldn't want to be on Medicaid. And we asked the question, why is that? Why is it that DeMonte Driver dies from a toothache in Medicaid because he never receives care? We don't think Medicaid is the optimal way to continue to provide health care coverage, and it's why we are supportive of many of the reforms that were in the Graham-Cassidy legislation. It's why we move forward with state health care block grants, because we're trying to do it better. We're trying to make sure that the populations that Medicaid was designed to cover get the care.
Well, it's interesting that there is not anyone involved in the Medicaid program who is involved in delivering care that really believes that this is a reform. And the good news is this budget will never become law, and I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Horsford from New York for 5 minutes.
From Nevada. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
From Nevada, my apologies.
I appreciate this hearing very much. Thank you for being here, Acting Director. Vice President Biden used to say, quote, "Show me your budget and I'll tell you what you value." Well, based on this budget, Trump values corporate profits over Medicare. He plans to cut Medicare by anywhere from $500 billion to $840 billion. He values continuing tax breaks for the rich while imposing devastating cuts to needy children, families on Medicaid and child nutrition assistance, and seniors on Medicare. This is his budget. This is the GOP budget. Sadly, few of my colleagues on the other side are here to continue to defend this budget. You have a tough job. I hope a vote is scheduled on this bill so that every single member of this body has to demonstrate where they stand and what their values are. You talked about vision. I think it speaks a lot to our values. First, I want to cover something specific to my district and address the Yucca Mountain Nuclear Waste Repository located in Nevada's 4th District, about 90 miles northwest of Las Vegas. The state of Nevada has filed 218 contentions against storing radioactive waste at Yucca, many of which challenge the Department of Energy's research and analysis, and the people of Nevada don't want it. Even the president said he agreed with us. In a visit to our state in October of 2018, President Trump said, and I quote, "I think you should do things where people want them to happen, so I would be very inclined to be against it. We will be looking at it very seriously over the next few weeks, and I agree with the people of Nevada." Well, Mr. President, if you agree, what changed? I'd like to enter into the record a letter from Governor Sisolak from the state of Nevada, dated to February 27th to President Trump, requesting a meeting to express our objections and to hear directly from the president why he includes this in his budget. So,
without objection.
Thank you. Why is the president breaking his promise that he made to the people in October of 2018 in Nevada by proposing $116 million of funding for Yucca Mountain?
He's not breaking his promise, and he is very open to the conversation that he...
Will you make sure he receives this letter from our governor?
Absolutely.
Thank you. On to military construction. The president requested $3.6 billion for a 2020 Department of Defense emergency fund to backfill the 2019 military construction projects that he is deferring for his emergency declaration for the wall. Ms. Director, the president's proposal threatens to cut federal funding from previously approved projects for active duty military efforts in my district. In my district, we have Creech Air Force Base. It's at risk of losing $59 million. This is a base that is performing critical military missions across the world. Nellis Air Force Base is at risk of losing $5.9 million, and the National Guard Readiness Center in North Las Vegas, all in my district, are at risk of losing $32 million. Can you assure me that none of these projects in my district will be delayed or have funds stripped away to pay for a useless border wall?
Here's what I can say, Congressman. All of the projects that you've just mentioned, I don't have the ability to say one way or the other. I don't know if it's because these are...
Yes or no? Will they be delayed? Will these projects that are providing critical missions for our national security? We talk about national security in this hearing all the time. and you guys are proposing to move money from active duty military that's in need in order for these individuals to meet their obligations.
We have not identified the projects that would be eligible for a delay into.
But you've identified the $3.6 billion you're moving from that fund.
We've identified the level of funding that we think we would be comfortable based on certain requirements. The types.
Let me reclaim my time.
When the projects later in the.
Let me reclaim my time. Today, we're also talking about cuts to Medicaid. More than 640,000 Nevadans rely on Medicaid. There's a proposal in here based on the Graham-Cassidy bill, a bill that could not even pass the Republican-controlled Senate, House, and White House. And now you have this in your budget. It was opposed by 9 Republican governors, including Nevada's former governor, Brian Sandoval. Why is your administration pushing a failed proposal once again?
Because we think it's good policy and it will lead to better outcomes.
You couldn't get it passed by your own colleagues in the last Congress. Why do you think it's going to change now that we're in the majority?
Because this administration's budget is about putting forward our vision for the country.
This administration's budget is dead on arrival in the House.
I want to thank the gentleman from Nevada. Now recognize the ranking member from Arkansas, Mr. Womack.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moulton. And Mr. Vogt, thanks again for being here today. I'll try not to take up all of my time. You got a tough job. I mean, how do you, if you look at the spectrum of the federal government, what we fund, how is it possible to come up with any kind of a plan, any kind of a budget that could satisfy all of the desires, all of the pet projects, all of the needs, all of the urgencies? How is it possible to do that when you have a limited amount of resources with which to work? How do you do it?
You can't. We live in a resource-constrained world. Every family across the country lives in a resource-constrained world. And so you try to accomplish what is absolutely vital under the Constitution in terms of the role of the federal government, and then you try to make all of the investments that are necessary and prudent. And we do it, we take a long time to compose these budgets because it's a labor-intensive work product.
Is it fair to say that the priorities change from year to year? There are different sets of urgent matters that come up from time to time that you have to take a look at? In other words, it's kind of a fluid budgetary environment, is it not?
Sure, that's one of the reasons why we believe in budgeting every year, is we think we should be doing more budgeting, not less.
Do you think the American people that may be watching this hearing or catching excerpts of it can relate to the fact that there are always more things you want or need than there are resources to provide? Do they do this at home?
They do, and I think they understand the exercise that we are called by statute to do, which is attempt to budget for the federal government along the lines of how they do it.
So along the course of time, in a family budget, much like the federal budget, on a much smaller scale, from time to time there will be not enough resources to do the things that you'd like to see on the expense side of the ledger. So what do they do? What do you do at your house?
We figure out what money is coming in, and we figure out how much we can afford, and we allocate our spending accordingly. And we just do the best we possibly can. We try to avoid debt. That's something that every family tries to do, is when they're trying to get serious about their fiscal house, what do? They tear up their credit cards.
Do you make some tough choices?
We do.
And these choices sometimes can be somewhat painful. They can deny you some things that you might otherwise have that makes life a little easier to go through day upon day. But at the end of the day, you got to make some tough choices, don't you?
We do.
You ever weaned a calf?
I have not.
Have not? You know what happens when, I'm from cattle country. What happens when you wean a calf?
I'd be interested to hear.
It's one of the noisiest, loudest, heartbreaking events that a cattleman goes through. But he knows he has to do it. And I use this example not at the risk of somebody from the other side saying that the ranking member wants to compare people to cattle. I don't. I just suggest that any time that you take somebody off of something they've become dependent on, in the case of weaning a calf and its mama, there is a wailing and gnashing of teeth unlike you see. So when you present a budget that makes some of the tough choices I just talked about, you can expect that there's going to be a lot of angst to go along with that, right? Would you not suggest that we have to do those tough choices in order to prepare ourselves to be stronger in the future fiscally?
I agree with that, sir. And I think that's one of the importance of a fiscal goal. When you have a fiscal goal, it allows you to make trade-offs. That's why we think balance is so important, even if it's over a 15-year window. It's because it allows us to enter every one of the decisions that you're just referring to and saying, all right, can we afford this? And if not, how do we either pay for it or not spend on it?
So there are things on the expense side of the ledger that are must do. Federal government, it says provide for the common defense. We can argue about how much, but we have to do that, do we not? It's in the Constitution.
We do. It's one of the most vital roles of the federal government.
Now, provide for the general welfare, I mean, that is a kind of a broad subject, and I think we can have a debate that goes a long time about what constitutes general welfare, what doesn't. But there was a comment, I'm using one example of many that came up in this hearing today on the other side about CDBG. And I'm an old mayor, so I'm very familiar with the Community Development Block Grant Program, and the budget proposes to eliminate it, correct?
It does.
Are you familiar with the revenue sharing that the federal government used to do? It was a program. It was federal revenue sharing. I think it was introduced to the nation in like I want to say Nixon signed it into law. I could be wrong, but it's around 1971, 72 that federal revenue sharing, and I think it was born out of a need in New York with a big budget deficit, that we were going to take federal money and share it with other political subdivisions beneath the federal government, state and local. And then I remember, because I was a city council member in the early 1980s, when federal revenue sharing ended. And much like the bawling of a calf at weaning, there were mayors and others associated with local government that screamed to high heaven that this was going to be terribly damaging to the balance sheets of a lot of our cities and towns. And it seems like they survived. We did. But we became dependent on something, and it was part of our regular revenue stream, and so therefore we just assumed it was always going to be there. $22 trillion in debt is a lot of money. Do you not agree?
I totally agree.
$1 trillion deficits that will feed into that $22 trillion is a lot of money. Would you not agree?
Totally agree.
So in order to make the tough choices we talked about earlier, we're going to have to examine the spectrum of the federal government. And as you said early on in your testimony, I think it was in response, it may have been in your opening, but certainly early on in one of your responses, you talked about how it was important for federal bureaucracies on the discretionary side, because we spent a lot of time talking about mandatory spending, but you said on the discretionary side, we cannot forget that there are places where we can reanalyze our priorities and approach our budget perspective in a sense that we're addressing the urgent needs with an eye on fiscal responsibility. Did you not?
I did say that.
And so as part of your budget, you do advocate for that the discretionary budget of the federal government cannot be held exempt from a lot of the examination that we've talked about on the mandatory side.
Absolutely. We don't believe any part of the federal government spending should be exempt.
Okay. You've got a difficult job, and before I close, I just want to acknowledge a number of people that are seated behind you. I'm assuming that a lot of these folks are staff. I know there's one guy back there with red hair that used to work for me, so I know he's part of your staff. And I just want to give a shout out to your staff because they've spent a lot of midnight oil trying to prepare a document that a lot of people are going to throw a lot of throw a lot of tomatoes at. But between now and the time that we fund the government on October 1st of 2020, we've still got a lot of ground to plow and a lot of decisions to make that between the legislative and executive branch, we'll do our best to put America's priorities.
I appreciate that, saying that, Congressman, and I appreciate the staff, as you mentioned, that has done so much to prepare this budget. It's a 6-month process, and it takes a lot of late nights, and so I thank you for reflecting that.
Yeah, thank you very much for your testimony. I yield back.
I want to thank the ranking member. This is obviously a difficult and contentious process. I certainly agree with you on that. Mr. Vogt, I certainly hope that to pick up the analogy of weaning calves, that it's clear from your budget that the administration hears the bawling, the angst of the most privileged in America who are afraid of losing their tax cuts. And I just hope that the administration can also hear the bawling, the angst of the least privileged Americans who are just trying to feed their families. So thank you, Acting Director Vogt, for being with us today. Please be advised, members can submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any member who wishes to submit a question for the record may do so within 7 days. Without objection, this hearing is adjourned.